Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Doolittle Institute. I'm Johnny Edwards. I'm a project coordinator here, and we're thrilled to have the audience that's here with us here in the auditorium, as well as our virtual audience online. Thanks for being here and being a part of our Global Future Speaker Series. This one is on China 2.0. It's Gordon Chang again with Miss Cleo Paskal. And I'm going to introduce our director, Chad McCoy, who is going to give a little bit more information about our speakers today. Thank you. Chad?
Good morning, Chad McCoy. So DI is excited to have repeat offenders back here. We've had Gordon Chang last year. Having him back this year is great. But this time we decided to have a panel and to have some more interactive nature of this Q&A. And we brought Cleo Paskal, which was a recommendation. They've worked together on different panels or done this before, and so we're excited to see how this goes. I'm not going to do an introduction for them and their backgrounds. I'm going to let them do that because I'll mess it up. But we are excited to have them, and hopefully this is it continues to be interactive. Ask some hard questions, and the online audience, I guess, has already sent a lot of questions in. So looking forward to the next few hours, and hopefully we're all enlightened and not scared to death after this discussion on China and Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chad and Johnny, and thank you all for participating here today. We start with some context for recent developments. Today, the world is changing far faster than our ability to understand it. And this means, among other things, that we very well may have assumptions that are obsolete. And as a result, we may not comprehend the danger. It feels like we have passed an historic inflection point, transitioning from a period of general calm to one of constant turbulence. And this could be history's next great conflict as war spreads east and west from Ukraine, across the Eurasian landmass, and perhaps to North Africa. And this war could be of unimaginable devastation. Vladimir Putin on February 27 put his nuclear forces on high alert. That was a few days after he threatened his strategic arsenal, his intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, on the last day of February, President Biden told the American people, don't worry about nuclear war. But on the following day, March 1, Putin actually sortied his ballistic missile submarines and his land-based missile launchers in what he called a drill. Russia has a doctrine that has been called escalate to de-escalate, or as General Hyten said before he retired, escalate to win. In other words, using or threatening to use nuclear weapons early in a conventional conflict. Now, if the invasion in Ukraine continues to falter for Russia, a big if, but if it continues to falter, then Putin will have an especially low threshold of risk. But we cannot give in to his nuke threats, because if we do, he will make threats to use his most dangerous weapons against the 3 Baltic states in an attempt to grab them, as well as perhaps Poland. And in addition, that'll encourage Xi Jinping to continue with his threats to use his nuclear weapons. So for instance, in July of last year, China threatened to incinerate Japan because of its expressed support for Taiwan. In September, the Chinese threatened to nuke Australia because, along with the US and the UK, Australia formed the AUKUS Pact. Now, periodically throughout this decade, throughout this century, China has made unprovoked threats to incinerate American cities. And on March 10th, the Chinese military threatened, quote unquote, worst consequences for any country that came to the support of Taiwan. Now, Beijing has this official no first use policy, but obviously the series of threats make us doubt whether that's in fact Chinese doctrine. It is no coincidence that these two aggressive states are working together, and they both have grand designs. Russia wants to annex neighbors to reconstitute either the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And Xi Jinping wants to annex the world and the near parts of the solar system, which we'll talk about in a few moments. You know, of course, these two grand designs ultimately conflict with each other, but that's not important, because what's important is in the here and now, we are seeing China and Russia work together. They see their interests coincide. They both want to take down the United States, and they want to take down the liberal international order. So as a result, we have seen China support Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. Now, this was something which was clear on February 4th when Vladimir Putin went to Beijing, where they had that meeting between the Chinese and the Russian leaders. And it appears then that Xi Jinping actually greenlighted the Ukraine invasion. They issued that 5,000-word joint statement that talked about their no limits partnership, that no area of cooperation was forbidden. And since that time, China has been making elevated purchases of Russian commodities. In other words, it's been financing Russia's war effort. But that's not the only thing. We have seen Chinese institutions open up to their Russian counterparts, as the Russian companies and banks have been sanctioned by the United States and the West. We have seen Beijing put its diplomats in the service of the Kremlin. And we've also witnessed that the Chinese central government and the Communist Party have put their propaganda machines to amplify these absurd Russian narratives. There is open source reporting that China has been feeding location data to Russia. The Ukrainians have been using these Chinese-made drones from DJI, the Shenzhen-based company. Well, there's reporting that China's been providing that data to Russia so that Russia can take out Ukrainian drone operators. And then, of course, there was the Chinese shipment of arms to Serbia last week. We don't know where those weapons will end up, but it's a possibility that the Ukrainians could see them in their country. Now, many people say, well, look, China's supporting Russia, and that's the case. But we've also witnessed in the last 3 or 4 days an interesting development, in the sense that Chinese institutions have not been buying Russian commodities for spot purchase in the late spring. Also, there was a report yesterday that Chinese banks are no longer offering UnionPay, their credit card, to Russia. If this is indeed the case, if these reports are true, it's probably due to extreme pressure from Washington. So there will be this play between Moscow and Washington trying to push China in their own directions. Many people say, though, that after the initial poor performance of the Russian troops in Ukraine, that China has been deterred, less likely to invade Taiwan. This is pure speculation. Because of this, what we have seen recently are factors that both inhibit and encourage China to take on dangerous projects. So for instance, inhibiting an invasion, well, of course, that's the reminder to the Chinese that war is uncertain. The Chinese have this view that big countries get to do what they want. They've had a demonstration that that's not necessarily the case. They have seen, of course, the effectiveness of the Ukrainian resistance and fighting forces. That must also give them pause. Also, the ability of Washington to rally the West to impose sanctions on Russia. On the other side of the ledger, though, there was the complete failure of American foreign policy to deter a far weaker state. There was a failure to impose comprehensive sanctions, total sanctions on Russia, and a failure to impose any sanctions on all for Chinese sanctions busting. There's been the breakdown of the international system, which must also encourage China. And one other factor that we often don't talk about, and that is the Ukraine invasion has accelerated deglobalization. And this means that China eventually will become less important in global supply chains, and that means China will have much less leverage in the future. That pushes China to move faster than it might otherwise. On top of all of this, there are developments such as the militarization of the Chinese political system and the Chinese political system becoming less transparent and more volatile. The country's problems also have become more severe recently, something we'll talk about. And this, of course, gives incentive for China to act because these factors are so serious that they undermine China's ability to do what it wants. Now, I do not know how all of these competing factors are weighed, in fact, by the Chinese leadership. But there's one thing that we do know, and that we do know that deterrence is breaking down. And we don't have to speculate about this because the Chinese themselves have told us about it. So for instance, in the middle of March of last year, China sent its top two diplomats, Yang Jiechi and his subordinate, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, to Anchorage to lecture, not speak to, but to lecture Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And in words which Yang Jiechi mentioned with evident delight, he was saying that the United States could no longer talk to China, quote, from a position of strength. The Chinese elites are especially arrogant these days. We got a lesson on this in November 2020 when Chinese academic Di Dongsheng gave a live stream lecture to China. His comments that showed the breathtaking arrogance of the Chinese elite these days when he talked about how China could determine outcomes at the top of the American political system. Di also said that China could make offers that no American could refuse and that China could buy every American. It's not important that what Di said was true or not. Of course, it's not true. But what's important is it reveals the mentality of the Chinese regime at this particular moment. And this could drive the regime to do things which are dangerous and indeed reckless. Unfortunately, the chaotic American withdrawal from Afghanistan confirmed in Chinese minds, that the end of American power is near. As the Afghan capital was falling, Beijing was pushing the point that the United States was incapable. So for instance, Global Times, which is a tabloid controlled by People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China. Global Times, hours after the Taliban captured Kabul, said that, asked the question, how could the United States have any possibility of standing up to China when we couldn't deal with ragtag insurgents? And the semi-official Global Times said, quote, referring to America, it cannot win wars anymore. In an editorial in August, the Global Times said that when China invades Taiwan, remember, they said when China invades, that the island would fall within hours and that the US military would not come to help. What makes this moment especially precarious and perilous in my mind is that we're seeing Chinese arrogance meet Chinese insecurity. There are a number of events which show that the Chinese state is coming apart at the seams. Perhaps most important is the debt crisis. Evergrande, which was once China's largest property developer, and about a dozen other Chinese property developers and other companies have not been able to meet their bond and other obligations since September. Now, China can postpone a reckoning. It has the ability to do so because it runs a closed system, but nonetheless, it cannot avoid a final debt crisis. And it cannot avoid a debt crisis because there's just too much debt in the system. But it's not just the debt crisis. China has a stagnant economy. It has worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, and as we've all seen in the last week or so, accelerated COVID-19 lockdowns in Shanghai and other places throughout the country. But to make matters worse, all of this is occurring while China is on the edge of the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. Two Chinese demographers last fall published a study which said that China would lose about half its population within 45 years. If you do the arithmetic, probably China ends up this century, at the end of this century, with maybe about a third of the people that it currently has, which means that it probably will have a population comparable to a country called the United States of America. So I believe that Chinese leaders are indeed seeing a closing window of opportunity. And all of this means is that the United States, as a matter of urgency, needs to reestablish deterrence. And of course, nowhere is deterrence more important than in the Strait of Taiwan. After the fall of Kabul, we both angered and we disheartened our allies and friends. And especially with the failure of deterrence in Ukraine, Taiwan has become the test of US credibility and resolve. Now, for decades, we have had a policy in Washington of strategic ambiguity. In other words, not telling either Washington, either Beijing or Taipei, what we would do in the face of imminent conflict. And of course, history tells us this policy worked, was very successful. But it worked in a benign period. And we are no longer in a benign period. Now, Chinese leaders say that we no longer deter them, so therefore we should take them at their word. And that means we need to consider new tactics going forward. I believe that the President of the United States should clearly declare that the United States will defend Taiwan and that we will offer a mutual defense treaty to Taipei. And in order not to repeat the mistakes of Ukraine, we should be sending weapons there now, and we should be even basing American troops there as a tripwire, like we do in South Korea. People are going to say, oh, that's extraordinarily risky. Yeah. It is extraordinarily risky. But to say that something is risky these days is not a meaningful objection, because after 3 decades of atrocious, misguided American policy, we have put ourselves in a position where there are no risk-free options. Everything going forward is dangerous, and the most dangerous option is continuing to do the things that put us into this situation in the first place. While deterrence is failing, China is arming fast. Last year, they conducted 2 tests of their hypersonic glide vehicle. Recently released satellite imagery shows that they're digging perhaps 250, maybe as many as 345 holes in 3 deserts, in Guangzhou, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. These holes look like they are going to be silos for the DF-41. A DF-41 has a range of 9,300 miles, and from those desert locations, they can reach any spot in the United States. A DF-41 carries 10 warheads apiece. Now, China has built decoy silos before, but I believe that we do have to assume the worst because China is sprinting to nuclear superiority. And Chinese policymakers and leaders have done things to increase the apprehension of Americans. So in addition to making threats to kill Americans by the hundreds of millions, we have seen China rebuff all attempts that we have made to engage them in arms control. And of course, China and Russia are working very closely together, something that became evident this year. One final point, and it's a point about context. A couple months ago, a friend of mine, Jim Holmes of the Naval War College, told me that this moment reminds him of 1937. Now, 1937 was a year in which if you lived in America or Europe, you could sense the danger. If you lived in Asia in 1937, you were even more worried because that year saw the second Japanese invasion of China that decade. But no matter where you lived in the world, you could not be sure that the worst would happen, that great armies and navies would clash around the planet. But in fact, the worst did happen. In fact, what happened was far worse than what anyone thought at the time. And unfortunately, we have returned, perhaps not to 1937, but to 1939. So let's consider one possible 1930s type scenario. Now that Russia has gotten our attention, Russia's friends, China, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, Algeria, could move against their enemies. That would be Philippines, Japan, India, Taiwan in the case of China, South Korea in the case of North Korea, Israel in the case of Iran, India in the case of Pakistan, and Morocco in the case of Algeria. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how wars spread across the Eurasian landmass and perhaps to other parts of the world. So yes, the calendar does say it is 2022, but it sure feels like 1939. 1939? Xi Jinping, on July 1st of last year, in a speech marking the centennial of China's ruling organization, said that he was wanting to, quote, crack skulls and spill blood of those who stood in his way. I don't think he was speaking figuratively, but in more significant and chilling words, he also said this, quote, the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people, with their bravery and tenacity, solemnly proclaim to the world that the Chinese people are not only good at taking down the old world, but good at building a new one. And these words mean that Xi Jinping is working to impose China's imperial era system, where Chinese emperors believe that they not only had the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, we're all under heaven, but that heaven compelled them to actually rule the entire world. Now, Xi Jinping has been talking about these Tianxia themes throughout this century and into the recent years, and so have his officials. But Xi is not just content to compete with us in the existing Westphalian international order. He doesn't even want to adjust that order, as smart people in Washington tell you. He wants to overthrow that order altogether, an order that's been in place since 1648. And it is just a revolutionary now who is running China. Now, many figures in history have wanted to rule the world. Xi Jinping wants to rule the solar system. So beginning in 2018, his officials have talked about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. That's right, a part of the People's Republic of China, which means that they consider those heavenly bodies to be like the South China Sea, theirs and theirs alone. And that means that they will exclude others from going there if they get the opportunity to do so. And we don't have to speculate about that because Chinese officials say they'll exclude us if they get there first and get the capability to do that. April of last year, China announced the name of its Mars rover. The name of the rover, they told us, was Zhurong, the Chinese mythical god of fire. Yes, Zhurong is the mythical Chinese god of fire, but what Beijing didn't tell us was that he's also the god of war and the god of the South China Sea. Unfortunately, we have a political leadership in this country, both parties, liberals and conservatives, they're all guilty. They are deliberately not listening to what Xi Jinping and Chinese people have been telling us. The Communist Party of China does not try to hide its animosity. They go out of their way to tell us how much they hate us. So for instance, in May 2019, People's Daily, and this is official, People's Daily declares a quote unquote people's war on the United States. And this hostility has continued to the present day. August 29th of last year, People's Daily runs a piece that accuses the United States of committing barbaric acts, quote unquote, against China. That propaganda blast, which was in a landmark editorial, was not a one-off because on August 21st, Global Times ran a piece that said the United States was conspiring with China's enemies. We Americans have chosen not to see the hostility of the Communist Party. And when we've seen it, we've been perplexed by it. Should we really be concerned by what are just mere words? I think we have to be extremely concerned, because what Beijing is doing is it is establishing a justification for the killing of Americans in great numbers. That's not to say China will do it, but that's to say China is now creating the basis for which it is justifiable to do this. James Lilly, our great ambassador to Beijing at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, said China always telegraphs its punches. And that's exactly what the Chinese are doing now. So Beijing has been telling us what it wants to do, and that means that we must rebuild our defenses, reestablish deterrence, and we do not have a moment to lose. Thank you. Questions? You all agree with me, so we can go home, right? Yes, sir, in the back. Oh, you have to come up to the microphone. Sorry.
So you had made some mentions of some economic systems that were in play in China in terms of land development. Can you comment on keystone means by which we can destabilize them from an economic perspective, but also militarily? And I don't know if that was something that you were leading into, but it seemed like you were sort of guiding us thoughtfully.
Yeah, this is a really important point. You know, history is going to look back at us Americans and say, we are the ones who enabled China through our purchases of Chinese goods, through our investment in the Chinese markets. We enabled them to build the military that was obviously been configured to kill Americans. And I didn't quite hear all of your question, but my point is, I believe that we shouldn't be buying goods from China. We should make it illegal to invest in Chinese markets. The Chinese should not be investing in our market. They should not be raising money on the New York Stock Exchange. We should not have technical cooperation agreements with China. I mean, I'm sorry, but Dr. Fauci did fund gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And you know, he said to Senator Rand Paul, he didn't do it. He testified twice before Congress, before the Senate last year. But there are 2 research papers published in public, 2016, 2017, from researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which describe gain of function research, which specifically acknowledge funding from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In other words, Dr. Fauci's unit at the National Institute of Health. We have funded coronavirus research that I believe has been weaponized. Now, there's a whole lot of stories and a whole lot of speculation about this, but the point is, we have done this. We shouldn't be doing it. It makes no sense. In 2014, the Obama administration actually issued a moratorium on gain of function research in the United States. What we did was we farmed it out to people who might actually weaponize it. This is wrong. This is morally wrong. This is strategically wrong. We need to end it. There's a question up here from Anonymous. Let's see, what are your thoughts on what appears to be a significant fear of escalation by the US in their trickle feed of resources to assist the Ukrainian military? Really important question, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. President Biden has made it very clear that he's been intimidated by Putin's thoughts. And we can take it from Biden himself, because he warns about, for instance, nuclear war. He talks about World War III. So obviously he has been intimidated by these threats, which means that in Beijing, they said, well, you know, if we can get the United States not to support Ukraine in an evident and act of aggression, then clearly the Chinese are probably thinking that they can make similar threats to prevent the United States from defending Taiwan or Japan or Australia or whatever. It's just common sense. So, you know, this is an extraordinarily dangerous period, but the President of the United States needs to say what Emmanuel Macron said to Putin, and that is, we got nukes too. And yes, that's dangerous, but through really bad policy. And this is not just a Biden problem. This is a problem of every American president going back to at least the end of last century. The Chinese make threats to kill Americans with nuclear weapons, and we say nothing. We say nothing about this. And, you know, people might say, oh, you know, we shouldn't pay attention. We shouldn't fuel their narratives. But what we are doing in Chinese minds are saying that the United States is afraid of us. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm saying that's what the Chinese think. And so we have created the situation where Putin could think he could make these threats and get away with it, and he is getting away with it. As General Hyten said in a speech that he gave a couple of days ago, now retired, when you take the use of our arsenal off the table, which was President Biden did, you just open the door for more nuclear threats. That's in fact what the president has done. He has made this perhaps the most dangerous period in history. And as I said, anything that you do to try to remedy this is going to be dangerous as well. But this is where really bad policy puts you. Yeah.
I put this on the slide also, but you mentioned the idea of a defense pact with Taiwan. Would that require diplomatic recognition? And do you know of anyone in Washington who's contemplating such a thing?
Yeah. Mike Pompeo, retired Secretary of State, when he went to Taipei last month, talked about recognition of Taiwan. And that's something, yes, that we could do. I should have probably put it on my list. But clearly, you know, really what we have done with our one China policy is we've left this sort of ambiguous. We say we recognize that the Communist Party is the legitimate government of China. In other words, that China, the Communist Party won the Civil War, the Chinese Civil War. And we acknowledge that Beijing makes the claim to Taiwan, but we acknowledge it in the sense of saying, not that we agree with it necessarily, but that we recognize that they make that claim. And then what we also say is, and the reason why I'm going through this is because there's a lot of confusion about what our one China policy actually means. We then say the status of Taiwan is unresolved and that it must be resolved peacefully. What I think we should do, as I mentioned, is we need to flip that and go basically to say, yes, we'll defend the place. Because if we'll say that, the Chinese won't invade. They'll huff and puff, but they will not invade. And you're looking at me quizzically. The reason why they won't invade, very simple one. China right now is casualty averse. You know, they in their propaganda, they say their one big military advantage over the US is because they're willing to accept casualties and we're not. That's not true. And I'll give you an example that shows you the reason. The night, and Cleo is the world's expert on this. On the night of June 15, 2020, China launched a surprise attack on Ladakh, high in the Himalayas, killed 20 Indian soldiers. New Delhi immediately announces not only the names, but they know we lost 20 soldiers that night. China does not acknowledge any casualties until the following February. And then they say they lost 4. Go on about 4 or 5 months past, the Russian news agency says, well, we think China lost 45 soldiers that night, 45 deaths, which is consistent with New Delhi's casualty estimate for China. Beijing is casualty averse because they know that with all the problems in China right now, the Chinese people are not up for military misadventure abroad. And I don't think with the Chinese lockdown in Shanghai right now and the rest of it, and it's not just Shanghai, it's other cities as well. I just don't think that the Chinese regime at this particular time is really, it realizes that if it loses soldiers in an invasion of Taiwan, that it would be lights out for the Communist Party. Because I think that they realize it would be unpopular, and it would be unpopular for a lot of reasons. So, you know, if we were to say that we're going to defend Taiwan, if we put a brigade in on the island, the Chinese are not going to invade because they do. The one thing about Communist Party foreign policy is that its number one goal is not reuniting China, as they say, or taking Taiwan. Their number one goal is maintenance of Communist Party power. And they realize that an invasion of Taiwan would be deeply, deeply unpopular in China right now. Oh, out of time. We have more time for Q&A later on, which we'll have a conversation with Cleo, and then we'll bring everybody in.
Thank you, sir. So there have been some questions in the Zoom link chat. If everyone could go to slido.com and use code 110079 and ask your questions there. At the end, there is a good 30 minutes of Q&A, and all of the questions will be addressed then. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ms. Cleo Paskal. Thank you.
Hello. I'm a little shorter than Ernest. It is an incredible honor and pleasure to not just be able to follow Gordon, but to be at the Doolittle Institute 80 years plus 3 days after the raid. And Gordon was talking about the relationship between a country and its military, and how China does not really want to even acknowledge its losses. And I think that acknowledging what happened 80 years plus 3 days ago is incredibly important for understanding what's going to happen going forward, what makes the US different, and how we're going to have to understand China better and refine some of the spirit of that raid if we're going to be able to get into it. And I know that they just had the final goblet ceremony, and I'd like to pay my respects to those men and what they accomplished. That was a win in terms of political warfare that is going to be essential going forward. There are two warfare fronts. There's kinetic and there's political warfare. And we are losing big time already on political warfare. And not only do we need the sort of innovation you're doing here on the kinetic front, but we also need that sort of innovation on the political warfare front. And to understand how we are losing big time and how China is winning big time, it helps to do what Gordon said, which is understand the words coming out of the Chinese Communist Party. And going back to James Lilly's quote of how China telegraphs its punches, if we take a look at some of the ideas that come out of the Chinese think tanks, it gives you a very good idea of how they look at the world. They tell you how they look at the world. And what is the goal of the Chinese Communist Party? Obviously, the preservation of the Chinese Communist Party. But then it is for China to be #1 in the world in terms of comprehensive national power. So has anybody here heard that term before? Okay, yeah. So the people who know China know it. It's part of the way that they frame the way that they look at the world. And it is fundamental for understanding how they view everything. And the idea is that the goal is for China to be #1 in terms of a very comprehensive matrix, which is empirical and includes things that we would consider elements of national power, like military or economic power, but it also includes access to resources, whether in your country or in another country, which is why if you can control another country that has the fertilizer that you need, you put that into your basket of comprehensive national power. It includes whether you have pandas in the zoo, which means somebody gave in to a little bit of political warfare front on that. It includes whether you don't want to provoke China, so you don't put your assets where they need to go. All of those things all have a numerical value, actual numerical value, in the context of the way that the Chinese analysts think of comprehensive national power. It also means that, and this goes to the Wuhan Institute issue, there are two ways of improving a country's comprehensive national power. One is you get better, which is kind of the traditional American way. You compete and you try to get better. The other is you knock the other one down. So if you have a situation, regardless of how the virus came to be, but you have an epidemic at home and you know you're going to take a big hit economically, if your psychology, if your framework is comprehensive national power competition, it makes sense to do what the Chinese Communist Party did, which is you ban internal flights, so you try to limit its spread internally. but you let everybody get on the planes and go all over the world as much as they like, so that everybody else gets hit. And you don't mention human to human transmission or any of the other things that you may know or that the Taiwanese have told us. And you try to downplay that risk while at the same time increasing your position while the catastrophe unfolds, including hoarding PPE or manufacturing PPE, that sort of stuff. So understanding how they view this comprehensive national power competition helps explain a lot of things that might seem incomprehensible if you come from a different mindset. And what underpins this comprehensive national power push is another term, which is the title of a book written by two Chinese Air Force colonels in the late 90s called Unrestricted Warfare. Right? So who's heard that one? Okay, good. We're broadening it a little bit. So the concept of unrestricted warfare is that basically nothing's off the table. It's in the title, right? When you're competing with somebody else in terms of trying to become number one in terms of comprehensive national power, you can do whatever you like. And if you look at that book, which is available in English translation for free online, you can see they've listed 24 different warfares that are considered legitimate, including all the ones you'd expect, but drug warfare. So when you look at fentanyl flowing onto the streets of Middle America, there is no incentive for the Chinese to stop the outflow of the precursors or the fentanyl to get into the US to destroy the society from within so that you create a political warfare win, so that you win without fighting, which is another one of the kind of goals that you hear. Sanctions warfare. This book came out over 20 years ago. They have been preparing for sanctions warfare for at least 20 years, trying to sanctions proof the economy, trying to create a position where you cannot cut them off like we're cutting off Russia. The list is all there. But among the 24 warfares, there are 3 warfares. This is another one of these terms that are considered kind of the warfares of warfares for this current political warfare phase, which is psychological warfare, media warfare, and lawfare. Now, psychological warfare, that was, the Doolittle raid was a military exercise that was fundamentally a huge psychological warfare win. And it forced the Japanese to pull back troops and to redesign the way that they were doing their defense. So it had a direct military effect, even though the actual strikes may not have done that much damage. This is China's flights over the Taiwan air defense identification zone on a very regular basis are like that. They're wearing down the defenses. They're testing. They're trying to lower the response threshold. So that's very active component, that psychological warfare component of what they're doing. The media warfare component, now we tend to think of the media as, a China Daily insert in the New York Times. There's that. But the bigger focus has been social media. And the amount of money, Kerry Grushanik, somebody who wrote a very good book on this, he estimates that like $10 billion a year is spent by the Chinese on various sorts of media warfare, but a lot of it on social media warfare. And a lot of it is automated. So you have this kind of mass customized manipulation going into things like Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And the goal in many cases, it might be to direct in a certain area, but it's predominantly to create divisions in societies, to weaken the societies. So they don't care whether you like ice cream or you don't like ice cream. They care that you hate the other person who likes the ice cream or doesn't like the ice cream, right? Just creating that division and pulling it apart and having you look at those divisions is the fundamental goal. And they work very well with the Russians on this and extremely effective. So when you hear media warfare, a lot of this is happening online. And lawfare is, we're constrained by laws and they're not. And it's not just that, they use our laws to constrain us. And I'll give you a kind of a concrete example of that now when I go into kind of the 2 specific zones, case studies. So I'm going to look at the two front lines of China from a military perspective, from a geographical perspective. The first is the land issue, and that's with India. The other is maritime, and that's with the Pacific Islands. So Gordon was talking about going back to 1939. I mean, we really are a dust off your World War II map kind of situation here. So we're going to look first at India. India is in many ways an existential threat to China. It is a country of over 1 billion people that is flawed but pluralistic. And it shows that you don't need to have an authoritarian, dictatorial, vicious government to run 1 billion people. And you don't need to throw 1 million Muslims in jail. And you don't need to, like, they just showed there's a whole different way of being a major emerging Asian country. And in that way, it's an existential threat to the idea behind the Chinese Communist Party, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And in a more practical level, it is also a very viable place to redirect supply chains. So you've got a young, 10 million Indians graduate from university every year. So there's huge disparities, but there's young English-speaking, educated, relatively affordable in terms of the international market, English-speaking population that you can redirect supply chains to quite easily. So that is a problem for China. They have to make you think you can't produce in India. Otherwise, everybody wants to move their supply chains out, will move it to India. So they had, and this goes to the political warfare thing. They have been trying to push China's been trying to push India kinetically since 1962. And as Gordon mentioned, in June of 2020, there was an attack by the Chinese forces on the border. Who followed that attack? Okay, all right, okay. So China does this salami slicing, this kind of incremental pushing across borders. And they had been doing that on the Indian border, starting from April, May. And then on that night in June, they attacked an small Indian patrol and brutally killed the colonel. The commanding officer, they bludgeoned him and pushed him off a ravine and into a frozen river. They had completely misunderstood the Indian psychology. They thought you kill the commanding officer, the Indians will run. The Indians are incredibly devoted to their commanding officers. They regrouped and counterattacked. Now, the reason there is no gunplay involved is because there had been an agreement that nobody would have guns with bullets in them on the border. So it was all done in hand-to-hand combat. And what's now coming out is it seems like the Indians said, yeah, we don't have guns, but we happen to have some bayonets lying around. So they did some very serious damage. And the numbers that we're hearing now seem to be kind of coalescing around, maybe killed about 45 PLA soldiers, unacknowledged. So that was a kinetic failure on the part of China. That didn't work. So it shifted very quickly to political warfare against India. And in the next few weeks, you started to see, or next few months, you saw an attack on the Mumbai electrical grid. You saw an attack by a communist-leaning union on an iPhone parts manufacturing plant in Bengaluru. It was a Taiwanese manufacturing plant. And the idea was, and the images went out over the internet very quickly, and the idea was to get people to think you can't redirect your supply chains. There was an attack by Maoists on Indian security personnel that killed about 20 people. There were all of these things. There was the Delta variant, which was originally the India variant, if you remember. There was a lot of packaging around that, especially in Asia, trying to give the impression that Indians are diseased. So you had Indians in Hong Kong who couldn't get a taxi because they were that Indian variant narrative, messaging, wording was being pushed out all over the internet. It was very, very comprehensive political warfare. The Indians know this. And so 2 weeks after their 20 soldiers died or murdered in Galwan, their first major response was to ban 59 Chinese apps. And that woke a lot of us up. They banned, among others, TikTok and WeChat. And that was a comprehensive national defense to a comprehensive national power push. And when I, talking to Indian colleagues about why did you ban these apps? I mean, do you not like dancing cats? Like, what's the issue here? And they said, well, if you've got Chinese metadata and you have Indian metadata, you've got about a third of the world's metadata, and it's extremely helpful for refining your AI systems and which can be obviously used in a military context. They wanted to deprive them of the metadata. That was one obvious reason. Another was they wanted to, there was a lot of ability to extract information from the phones, which could facilitate blackmail. There was a lot of industrial espionage that was being done through the apps. And this is another thing that's unique to India in the context of China. India competes for a lot of the same contracts in the developing world. So if you go into Africa, it's very hard for an American company to compete with a Chinese company to build a road or an airport. But an Indian company can do it. They have high quality engineers and they will hire the local people, and they're used to working in challenging environments. So you would end up getting, and of course, when China goes in and builds a road, it goes in with that commercial fronting, but there's a strategic element to it. And often actually, it's often braided with corruption. So it's incredibly corrosive internally in those countries. And so many would prefer to deal with an Indian company. Because they had WeChat on their phone, the Chinese competitors, because of civil military fusion, and because the Chinese government could help on the big contracts and extracting that data, could transmit the bids to the Chinese competing company, and the Chinese competitors were getting in bids just slightly lower than the Indian companies. So by banning these 59 apps, the Indians struck back at China in a way that was very enlightening and very helpful. And they also, at the same time, knocked about $6 billion off the valuation of ByteDance, which was the parent company of TikTok. So we need to talk about India, and I hope we will in the Q&A, because the Russia-India thing has been, not great. But understand that India feels like it is under attack from China, which it is, and that it may be alone in fighting China. It's not counting on the Russians. And after $80 billion worth of equipment were left in the hands of a terrorist organization who has as one of its stated goals destroying India, they're not so sure about counting on all of the US at the moment either. So they are looking at Make in India, going it alone, and trying to at least ensure that Russia doesn't side with China. But they're not counting on Russia backing them. So understanding that strategic environment is very important for discussing the India-Russia relationship. And by the way, today, Representative Ilhan Omar is in Pakistan talking about how terrible India is. So the US is giving a lot of very mixed messages to India about how supportive it is of its own two existential threats, which is terrorism and China. So I only have like a minute left, I think. Oh, okay. My boss says I can keep going. So the other environment, that was the land environment. The other one is maritime. And for maritime, this goes to what Gordon was talking about in terms of Taiwan and the maps. In 2008, Admiral Keating testified at I think a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, and said that a Chinese official, high-ranking Chinese official, had come up to him and said, "Look, there's a duplication of resources here. Why don't you take Hawaii East and we'll take Hawaii West, and we'll keep you appraised of what's going on in the Pacific. Don't worry about it." And it was a telegraphing your punches situation. Like, it sounded insane at the time. But when you look at Chinese political warfare in the Pacific Islands and how they are island hopping, we are back to the late 30s, early 40s with the Japanese, and they studied what went wrong with Japan. And I do have to say that, you know, I deliberately wore my cherry blossom thing today because in the Pacific Islands, Japan, we are at the Doolittle Institute. There was a horrific war, but Japan is one of the best allies in the Pacific now, and that really needs to be acknowledged. They understand the region. The islanders like working with them, and we have a problem, a real problem in the Pacific. You saw the security agreement that was just signed between the Solomon Islands and China. That was signed, so it was Kurt Campbell, who's President Biden's Indo-Pacific representative. If he's not in the Solomon Islands, will be arriving within the next day or two. The government of the Solomon Islands signed a security agreement with China. It was announced officially in the last week on the island of Guadalcanal. And this August will be the 80th anniversary, the beginning of the campaign of Guadalcanal. And that security agreement will, it allows, there's a draft that I think is probably pretty close to what was signed, will allow for PLA to be stationed, provisioned, logistical support all out of Guadalcanal, Tulagi. These names sound familiar, you know. And at the same time that the Solomon Islands switched from Taiwan to China in 2019, Kiribati switched from Taiwan to China. Kiribati is the country that contains Tarawa, Macon, Canton, which was a World War II U.S. airstrip. The Chinese are now talking about redeveloping as a tourist location. The penetration of the Pacific is incredibly important, and one of the reasons is, just to make sure that sort of we can flag this up, is Taiwan. So we tend to look at China to Taiwan, but if China is going to take Taiwan, you have to look at the map from Taiwan and then do the circle around it, and that's the only way they'll be secure in Taiwan. So they need to secure the Pacific Islands in a huge perimeter all around Taiwan, and they need Taiwan to break the first island chain. Right? So if you're looking at the coast, if you're in China and you're looking down the coast, you see Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, all the way down. And we know that, yes, China has this comprehensive national power push, but a key element of that comprehensive national power is the military, and the biggest element of the military is the Navy. And if they're going to move the Navy, they have to move it out past the first island chain. So we are back to that World War II map. They have to break the chain. So if they can take Taiwan, they can project power out from there. And to take Taiwan, they need to be able to secure all the way around. I'm pretty concerned about the situation in the islands. So is the administration. That's why Kurt Campbell has been sent to the Solomons. He just went to Fiji and he's going to PNG. And again, back to that World War II map, if you look at Papua New Guinea, Solomons, and Fiji, what you see is China trying to build an island chain off the coast of Australia to interdict Australia. That's that zone. That's those Melanesian islands. So hopefully we'll talk about the Quad, but China is now pushing India in its comprehensive way. It's trying to interdict Australia through a new island chain. And all of our allies in the region are panicking, which is why why Prime Minister Abe is saying maybe we should have US nukes on Japanese soil. So we're coming full circle on all of this. How do we do this? We'll talk about it in the panel. I think we need to look at what the Indians did in terms of a much more comprehensive national defense, but we really need allies. We really need to have a comprehensive multinational defense so that we're not getting picked off one by one, so that Australia doesn't get interdicted, so that Japan doesn't get isolated, so that the Philippines don't fall into that orbit. and start to work together, because we don't want to have 80 men on the deck of a carrier hoping for the best that they won't run out of fuel on the way over the coast. We're very grateful to them for having done that, but we don't want to be in that position ever again. And that planning has to start now. Thank you. Questions? Okay, significant discussion on China's, it's not important, so just, your thoughts on Taiwan's desire to remain independent. Green Party desires independence, but do the people of Taiwan want USA to come to their defense? Great question, because I forgot to mention what I was going to say about that, which is this is this kinetic versus political warfare thing. This is like the India thing. China is always one election away in Taiwan from taking Taiwan. They'd much prefer to take Taiwan politically. They'd much prefer to have somebody get elected in who just says, you know what, this is a total waste of time, ethnic brotherhood, whatever, we're just going to sort of join up. Only one election away at any moment, which is why there was an attempt to influence the elections last time around. So, and this is where the political warfare, media warfare component of it comes into play. If they can, I think the CCP is thinking if they can ramp up the psychological attack, make the people of Taiwan think an invasion is inevitable, gain the political wins, and have the media cover it in such a way so that it seems acceptable, then they think they can win without fighting. I hope they're wrong, but that's certainly the focus of billions of dollars and a lot of effort.
So I hear you talk about the different warfares, which is great to see the different angles that China has been taking throughout, many years. What do you think is their strategy of getting to other countries and bringing their infrastructure? You said that they're competing against, India to come and do roads. So do you think they are targeting countries that have their reach in natural resources to become allies or friends? So when things go bad, they go back and pay up, ask for a payout from those countries. I'm interested in how they're doing in South America, because that's also where I'm from. And I can see a lot of, in the last 20 years, how Chinese industry are moving in so strongly that have not been done in so many years.
How do you feel the people of the countries are?
So I think, in my opinion, because I'm from South America, I can see how they're taking advantage of the shift of power in politics. So they're more populist, more socialist. And then they're like, hey, we're going to come and bring you roads in this indigenous places and whatever. But those roads lead to really rich natural resources. So, and now they're taking students out to China. So more of like, hey, here that's what my question is. Do you think they're building allies in other places so they can explode them at the end when it's needed, knowing that what happened with the population and natural resources?
Thank you. So I think you've described the dynamic very well. There's a follow-on to that dynamic, which is, and we see it in places like the Solomons, which is, this is the Belt and Road Initiative type stuff, which I think BRI stands for Bribery and Repression Initiative, because it tends to start with bribery. But first of all, I have to say that China's taking advantage of failures of the Western system. There's no reason Africa didn't have this sort of investment before, or the Pacific Islands or South America. There were decades worth of lost opportunities on the part of other countries. We shouldn't have to throw Kurt Campbell on a plane in a rush to the Solomons because China is willing to build a stadium for the Pacific Games. So first, blame where blame is due. There's a lot of failure on the part of the West for a long time. But yes, they're definitely taking advantage of it. What tends to happen, and I'd be interested to know what you think maybe on the break after, is they tend to get involved then in land issues. So, which turns the local population against them. And they tend to bring in Chinese workers, not local workers, and their environmental standards are appalling. And so, yes, they build the infrastructure, which may or may not be good quality. Okay, it's not good quality usually. And then over time, the local population turns against them. Now, the problem with that is that you're dealing with democracies. And so if it stays democracy, the people who brought in the Chinese risk losing power. And we're seeing that blow up in Sri Lanka right now. I don't know if anybody's following the Sri Lankan situation. So it's a real disaster. They're having food riots and fuel riots, and the entire cabinet resigned. And this is because they got into hock with China, and their economy is a mess as a result. And they couldn't withstand the shock of what's happening with cascading economic shock of what's happening coming out of Russia with the food and fuel prices going up. And now this is the pivot point. We're seeing it in Sri Lanka. We're also seeing it in the Solomons. If there are free and fair elections, then you may end up with a government that kicks China out. So it is in the best interest of both China and that government that's in power now not to have free and fair elections. So the next stage of that BRI, the repression stage after the bribery, the repression stage means that you may end up with a lot more countries becoming more authoritarian. And then that makes the West cut them off even more, which gives them even fewer options than China. So we're seeing this happening over and over. In the Solomon Islands situation could be the vast majority of the people of the Solomons and the opposition parties and the provincial leaders all want to get rid of this corrupt pro-PRC prime minister. There's supposed to be free and fair elections. There's supposed to be elections in 2023. He's trying to get them abrogated. He would prefer to create a civil war in his country that justifies bringing in Chinese peacekeepers to put off the election than have an election. So what you're talking about is the beginning of a dynamic that is creating a whole other system that is extremely deep. And Gordon, just one last thing, Gordon was talking about, kind of all of these other allies hitting at the same time. In the case of Argentina, which has become very close to China, the UK has been ramping up in the Pacific. But if Argentina, backed by China, goes for the Falklands, UK gets pulled out of the Pacific. They have very limited military capacity. And either they give up the Falklands or they go back into the Atlantic. So if something happens and you have multiple triggers happening at the same time, this is why this multinational defense is so important, and understanding the comprehensive nature of the threat is so important, because the pieces are being put in place. Thank you. Yeah.
Why does China?
Okay.
Why does China insist on fighting India over that stupid glacier in Kashmir that can't possibly be of any strategic value, given the high political and other costs that go with that?
Siachen, yeah. So so there is it is actually pretty strategic. So there's the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which goes down from China down to Gwadar Port. So this is that corridor that goes kind of over the Himalayas and then quite close to the glacier, and that area, because of the height of that area, this is where the Galwan conflict happened in June 2020. There's the Karakoram Highway. They're kind of those points that are critical for China to be able to reach the Indian Ocean directly via Pakistan. I wish I had a map. Oh, okay, there you go. Yeah. No, but I have feet. But I may be too short. Yeah, it's up in there. Well, anyway. Pointed. Sorry. I know I've messed up your whole visual thing there. But there's a kind of if you think of kind of up at the top there where the bay is, there's the narrowest point from China down to the Indian Ocean. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so it would be kind of like down in here. This bypasses their Pacific Ocean problem. Okay, so it means that it means instead of taking everything off of this coast, they can come down through here. It also brings them much closer into the oil and gas areas, and it works on this whole string of pearls thing, where they're putting in bases that look like dual use, but they're primarily strategic all the way around. So that again, they can think of the Quad countries. Here are kind of the countries I was just talking about. The Solomons are over here. So you build up this chain that cuts off Australia and New Zealand, but who cares about New Zealand? And this is this first island chain. So they break out of here, they build up here, and they've got bases all the way along here and port access here. It changes the map. So that's why it's so important. That's why they are what they call Iron Brothers with Pakistan. And that is that Sino-Wahhabi alliance, which is very effective in Washington. So that's why when you see Ilhan Omar in Pakistan, you know, that's not just Pakistan. That benefits China. So it's worth. I'm glad you mentioned the map, because it's really important to look at the map now. But I'm aware that I'm quite over time, so I'm going to thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pascal. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We are going to do a conversation now with Ms. Pascal and Mr. Chang, and keep the questions coming because they're going to go through all of them before they leave today. So thank you for being interactive and adding the questions to the Slido. Again, the code is 110079. And with that, I will pass it off. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Johnny. What we're going to do is we'll have this conversation, and that conversation will include questions and comments from you as well. So Cleo, let's start off with India and the Ukraine invasion. A lot of people around the world were disappointed with the New Delhi's reaction. If you could just run through why Prime Minister Modi didn't side with Ukraine against Russia.
This is that decision was the tip of a very large iceberg. So a lot of things went into it. Part of it was fury at the way it happened. And also, just to be very clear, they have repeatedly said, their diplomats have repeatedly said, you know what, don't invade another country. It was wrong for Russia to invade. So what they're resisting is very much the sanctions and that sort of thing. There's a lot of background in a lot of it. Obviously, I think about 60% currently of the Indian military is Russian. And they need the spare parts. They're trying to create it internally. But during Galwan, during what happened on the border, the Indians were getting daily flights from Russia of parts and supplies and weapons that was enabling it to fight and push back against China. And from what I've heard, there were 2 flights that came from the US, one towards the end and one after it was over. So there was a sense that Russia will kind of back it up. And this is very much what Russia does. You know, part of its marketing of itself is to present itself as backing somebody like Assad, right? The US said the Russians are going to peel away from Assad in Syria and let him flounder. And they never did. They doubled down for their own strategic reasons.
Do you think that Russia would continue to supply parts and weapons to India after, for instance, China's backing, really full-throated backing for Russia after the Ukraine invasion?
What matters is what do the Indians think? And the Indians aren't sure. So that's why they're trying to actually start to design their own spare parts for the Russian equipment. But until that happens, they're kind of hedging their bets. Also, they do not. Ukraine and India do not have a great track record. So India was one of the first countries to recognize Ukraine, independent Ukraine. Ukraine, conversely, criticized India for its nuclear tests and repeatedly voted against it on issues like Kashmir. And this isn't to say that they condoned it being invaded. I'm just saying there wasn't a great relationship there. And there was, at the beginning of the invasion, the Russian invasion, there were about 20,000 Indian students in Ukraine. And the priority of the Indian government, which set the stage for their intervention, was very much getting out those students. And there was a lot of footage online of Ukrainian border guards turning away non-white people at the border trying to get out of Ukraine. And the perception was that they were almost trying to use the Indian students as hostages. And just talking about perception, and a lot of this perception could have been generated by Russian political warfare, was that that Ukraine wasn't averse to having some Indians die if it would shift public opinion against Russia. Conversely, the Russians, including at the UN, were very much in favor of trying to help the Indians get their students out. And this was a very high priority for India. They sent 4 government ministers, they sent the military to the border, and they got, except for one guy who died, every single one of their students out of Ukraine. And they feel with the help of the Russians. So that bought them a lot, that bought Moscow a lot of goodwill with the public. And the footage online of the Ukrainians not behaving in a way one would have hoped also affected it. Now this is a political warfare win. This is a general population win for the Russian side. And a lot of the Russian political warfare around Ukraine has happened in non-Western countries. So I had somebody from Tonga send me a TikTok video of a very busty Russian woman saying, thank you, United States, for banning McDonald's from Russia. So now we won't be fat like you. And in exchange, we're going to increase your price of oil so you have to walk everywhere so you can be healthy. This is from the Kingdom of Tonga.
One of the things that I thought was interesting was that India was a big backer of the Afghan government. And after the chaotic withdrawal by America from Afghanistan, a lot of the pro-Americans in the Indian security establishment were basically delegitimized. This is where bad policy has consequences that ripple beyond. And so you end up with the pro-Russians in New Delhi becoming just more influential. This is before the Ukraine invasion. So then I suppose that once you have the invasion, then Russia's friends in New Delhi are in a much more powerful position to influence the Modi government.
Yeah, and so this is, for me, this is the big question. I mean, what do you think about that Russia-China relationship?
I think that they're very, very close right now. A lot of analysts will say, well, China and Russia have views which are, and ambitions which are directly contradict each other and inconsistent. And that's true, but we don't worry about China and Russia 3 decades from now. What we worry about is what they're doing at this particular time. And so I think that we see China to the full extent doing all it can to support the Russian war effort. And as I mentioned in my initial remarks, when we have seen China in the most recent times, last couple of days, start to pull away from Russia, it's not because they want to pull away from Russia or they're embarrassed by what the Russians were doing or they're horrified by the atrocities of Russian troops. What they're doing is they're just really responding to Washington's extreme pressure. So, that 5,000 word joint statement is very clear what their intentions are and what their goals are going forward. And we have seen the 2 countries work very closely together. So at this moment, I think that they are basically, as they say, formed a new axis.
Who else is potentially part of the Axis.
Well, then you've got the countries that have traditionally gone with China. So Pakistan, talking about India, Pakistan and China have traditionally had very strong ties, and China's committed $62 billion to their China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is Belt and Road. And then, of course, there's North Korea, which China's proliferated nuclear weapons technology and missile technology. The North Koreans tested a hypersonic glide vehicle this year. I mean, and if you look at the North Korean pictures of the North Korean HGV, they look exactly like China's. So the question is, well, how did that happen? And so the least likely explanation is the North Koreans developed, this vehicle on their own. So they must have got help from either China or Russia, probably China. So that's Pakistan, that's North Korea, Iran, of course. The list goes on of bad actors. And a lot of those, following on from this question about Latin America, Venezuela and Cuba. And last year you had the red wave, which was called basically elections in so-called democratic states in Latin America that installed leftists. So Peru, Chile. We have important elections this year. This is just a region up for grabs. But, you can see that these countries are starting to align with China in various ways because, it's either money or it's ideology or whatever, but they are working very closely. So it is a pretty big part of the world. And as Biden said, there's going to be a new world order. And if there's a new world order, it means the world is cleaving into two, with China and Russia and their friends on one side and everybody else on the other.
Yeah.
The question is, where does that leave India?
Well, that's it. And there are a lot of countries that are looking for a third option. Not aligned, but just not aligned was never not aligned. But
India was not aligned in the Cold War, but it was really part of the Soviet bloc in a sense, or at least it followed Soviet thinking.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, as we discussed, that initial entry point is economic. When China comes in, it's economic, and then you get the bribery and the strategic positioning, all that stuff. And if that economic entry point could be cut off or an alternative given, combined with transparency, accountability, rule of law, this is how Australia cleaned itself up. There was a lot of Chinese influence within Australia, and then their intel services started leaking to the press about which politicians were getting which consulting deals from the Chinese. This is the Port of Darwin thing, right? And that put the fear of the press into a lot of Australian politicians and cleaned things up quite substantially. And I think that in the Solomons, for example, if Sogavari was investigated in Australia for disproportionate assets, that would scare a lot of the politicians who are supporting him into maybe going through a different track.
We'll get to questions from the floor in just a moment, but I just sort of like to ask one question. You talk about payments that China's been making. You brought to my attention that there was a list of Solomon Islands politicians who were getting help from China. And this list was in fact published. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, it was leaked, but we did publish it. It was 39 out of 50. There are 50 members of parliament. It's a parliamentary system. So, and this is also really important, what political system you have. So in the case of the Solomon Islands, it's a parliamentary system. It's a Westminster style system. So you can change prime minister mid-course. You can have a vote of no confidence and get rid of the leader. It's not like a presidential system. So in the case of the Solomons, there are 50 members of parliament. 39 of them were getting direct money out of Chinese bank account. Now, it was an interesting number because it was just over the 2/3 necessary for changing the constitution. And if you want to postpone the elections, you need to change the constitution. So this was leaked by people within the government of the Solomons who don't want this to happen to their country. And this is the important thing. If you democracy, transparency, accountability, rule of law are not slogans, right? They are weapons for truth and justice and a better future. And if you enable the people in the countries to have those weapons to fight against China, they are going to fight harder than anybody else will. The people of the countries that see their land being taken and their government being corrupted, the people of the Solomon Islands during the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Coast Watchers, they fought harder than just about anybody. I mean, they really did. Apparently, I'm not loud enough. It's not something my family has ever said, but okay. Is this better? Okay. Yeah, so can I tell this short little
Sure,
anecdote
of
about
course.
the Guadalcanal? So,
And before you do that, if you've got questions, come up to the mic.
Yeah.
So we will.
so John F. Kennedy's patrol boat was rammed by the Japanese and went down, and his life was saved by 2 Solomon Islanders. And when he was inaugurated, he invited the 2 Solomon Islanders to the inauguration. It was still a British colony at the time, and the British blocked those Solomon Islanders from attending the inauguration because they wanted to send one of their representatives, one of the kind of commanders from the white commanders from the Coast Watchers, to be the representative. That has consistently happened. Not still today. Australia wants to put itself between America and the Solomon Islanders. I heard yesterday that Kurt Campbell wanted to meet with leaders of the opposition in the Solomons, and the Australians were trying to block it. They probably won't succeed, but watch for that. Watch for the news of who Kurt Campbell meets with in the Solomon Islands. So not only are we not enabling the people to fight back from the ground level, but because some of our allies don't want to lose what they think is their important position in relation to the US, they are putting themselves in the way of creating much more effective partnerships.
You had mentioned that this part of the Pacific, the US has sort of said to Australia and to New Zealand, you guys manage it. You have primary responsibility.
Yeah.
And what's happened really is that that Australia and New Zealand have completely bollocksed it up, basically.
Yeah, that's actually the polite word. Part of the problem is this map, which is the traditional Atlantic-centric map, which doesn't let you imagine the Pacific as a cohesive whole. So you don't. I mean, it drives me crazy. If you look at the press releases coming out of the National Security Council now about the Kurt Campbell visit, they say he's visiting Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Hawaii, as if Hawaii is like not the U.S., like it's this other country. Like there's sort of this mentality of the U.S. not being a Pacific country is an artifact of this being of the history of the country, which puts the power on the East Coast. Right. So, if you're sitting in Washington, you think Hawaii is this other exotic place, and so imagine how people in Guam feel, right? The American citizens sitting in Guam, where China has said they have a Guam killer missile. So just very quickly, in terms of if you had a proper Pacific-centered map, what you'd see is the North Pacific, Micronesia, is the traditional U.S. zone of influence. These are the the freely associated states: Palau, Micronesia, Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, Marianas. Then this area, the Southwest Pacific, Melanesia, that's kind of the Australian, under the Five Eyes construct, zone of influence or strategic lead. And then Polynesia, which is kind of the zone between New Zealand and Hawaii, is the New Zealand zone. Like New Zealand, like 5 million people. And somebody was joking when the Tongan volcano went up and the U.S. sent a destroyer. The only reason to send a destroyer for an HADR mission in Tonga is to sink the New Zealand Navy. Like that, and this is not sort of an effective fighting force for that. So yes, we've cut it up, and Australia and New Zealand haven't been doing a great job.
Okay, there's a question came in online from Seymour. It's your thoughts on Taiwan's desire to remain independent. The Green Party, and that's the Democratic Progressive Party, the party that's in power now, desires independence, but do the people of Taiwan want USA to come to their defense?
You may want to follow up with the next.
The next question is from Anonymous. It says, will the US defend Taiwan with boots on the ground if China invades before the 2024 election?
What do you think?
There's a third one here. Oh, it's about basically Hong Kong. Well, this is fascinating because, you know, people in China view people in Taiwan as Chinese, but the people in Taiwan don't. If you look at self-identification surveys, basically these days, upwards of 80% view themselves as Taiwanese only. And the portion that view themselves as Chinese only is below 5%. And that represents significant erosion over the last decade, where it used to be 2/3 of the people in Taiwan would view themselves as Taiwanese only, and somewhere between 12 and 15% would view themselves as Chinese only. So you can see the shift in the way the people in Taiwan identify themselves. So when you don't think of yourselves as Chinese, then why would you become part of the People's Republic? I mean, you want to have good relations with Beijing, of course, but the point is that you don't see yourselves as part of the same ethnic group. And the Communist Party bases its rule on what's known as Han nationalism. So this is important for the people of Taiwan. And this shift is going to continue regardless of the politics on the island, as you see the Chinese elites who came over in 1949 in the Chinese Civil War, as these elites have lost power over time, and as they've assimilated into Taiwan society. So this has nothing to do with biology. It has everything to do with culture. And, you know, as we see, culture is the most important determinant of the way people operate. Beijing sort of views this as we can just sort of swamp Taiwan because we're much bigger, our economy can swamp theirs. But that's not the way Taiwanese view it. I mean, the Taiwanese, even, and when I practiced law in Shanghai, I had a number of people who were Taiwanese ethnically. They came over from Taiwan, and they maintained fiercely that Taiwan identity, even though they were working in China. So this is China's problem in the sense that, you know, you talk about political warfare. China has all sorts of political warfare on Taiwan, but none of it really seems to be working, and it's becoming less effective over time. And there's one other aspect to this. The Kuomintang, which is the party of Chiang Kai-shek, has just lost the cue cards. It has just become incapable. So it can't mount an effective opposition to the Democratic Progressive Party. One other thing about Taiwan and China, because someone here asked a question about Hong Kong, which relates. The question is whether.
I think the second from the top is a follow-up on what you're just talking about.
Your comment to both.
Does the population of Taiwan as a whole desire U.S. interdiction in a Chinese invasion, or do they prefer China control? Will they fight themselves?
Yeah, everyone wants the U.S. military to come in and help them, and the people in Taiwan do, of course. But in Taiwan, especially after the Ukraine invasion, they see that the United States really has not come to Ukraine's aid. And so they realize that they've got to do much more for their own defense. So there's now talk of, they're talking conscription again, they're talking civil defense, all of these things, which, if you go back a couple of years ago, nobody would have been discussing. And I think that's an important change in mentality. The problem is that the US has prevented Taiwan from really arming itself, because we've always tried to placate Beijing. And so we don't really sell them the weapons they need in the quantities they need it. And more important, we sell them the weapons that probably are not as useful for them as they really need. So yeah, it's just great to have an F-16, but of course, there's going to be no runway left in Taiwan. Take your pick, an hour and a half after China starts. So really what they need are anti-ship cruise missiles. They need cruise missiles that can hold cities in China hostage. And they need submarines. They need diesel submarines. Now, we don't make diesel submarines, which we should, by the way. But the point is, we've been blocking and we've been making it difficult for our allies to supply diesel submarines. This is really just bad policy on our part. So, people say, well, the people, people in Taiwan will fight to the last American. And yeah, there's a certain amount of that, but there's less of that. And we've got to acknowledge our own responsibility for crippling Taiwan's defense.
Do you think do you think that the U.S. would send if you could get them on the island?
Well, that really depends on the attitude of one guy, and we really don't know what he thinks. If we go back to August of last year, and in a conversation that President Biden had with George Stephanopoulos asked him the question directly, will we defend Taiwan? And Biden's answer was yes. Same thing happened on October 21st when Anderson Cooper sat down with the president in a CNN town hall. And Anderson Cooper asked him, are we going to defend Taiwan? Are we going to fight for it? And Biden said yes. But let's remember what happened after both of those conversations. Clearly, the president wants to do it. But after the conversations, Jen Psaki, press secretary, says, oh, no, there's no change in American foreign policy. Ned Price, State Department spokesman, said the same thing. Lloyd Austin, defense secretary, said, no, there's no change in policy. So essentially, we have, the question that Beijing is looking at is, who's in charge of the US government these days? Is it the president of the United States, who, by the way, under the Constitution has the responsibility for defining and implementing American foreign policy? Or is it Jen Psaki, the press secretary? So far it looks like Jen Psaki is leading in this race. But the question is, we don't know what this administration will do. And the problem is China doesn't, China looks at this and this is not only chaos in, American policy elsewhere, this is chaos in the White House. We need a president who's clear about this. We need to know what the policy is. Even if the policy isn't what I like, I'd like to know what the policy is, because this isn't working.
I think that's how a lot of the leadership in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, is feeling also, just unclear. It's difficult to understate how much has changed in the past year in the Indo-Pacific with Afghanistan and with Ukraine and the response to Ukraine. So after India's response to Ukraine, the Prime Minister of Japan came for a visit. There was a call with Morrison. The UAE sent a big economic delegation to Jammu and Kashmir just before the Organization of Islamic States meeting. Assad made his first trip outside Syria to the UAE for the public meeting. Like things are moving really, really fast, and part of it is concerned about how fast China's going to move, and concerned about what Washington's going to move, And one of the kind of key countries is South Korea. So, and there's just been a presidential election in South Korea. So how do you feel that, or how do you think? Sorry, this is something about the American media that drives me nuts, just when you ask people how they feel instead of what they think. So what do you think about South Korea's trajectory?
Well, on May 10th, South Korea will get a new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, who has been described as the conservative leaning president or candidate in the race. This was a really important election that was held on March 9th because you had Moon Jae-myung, who is very sort of, was very communist leaning. Was even more communist leaning than Moon Jae-in, the current president. So Lee Jae-myung was defeated by the narrowest of margins. But Yoon is leaning toward the United States. South Korea is important, as you point out. It's the world's 10th largest economy right now. And under its current president, it was leaned very closely to Beijing. Even though it had a mutual defense treaty with the United States, President Moon hated Americans. We know this because when President Trump went to Seoul, Moon Jae-in, the president, and his wife, the first lady, were there. And the first lady had this big blue butterfly brooch. And I'm sure Trump didn't know what was going on. Otherwise, he would have walked out. But the blue butterfly in South Korea is a symbol of anti-Americanism. So this was disrespecting not only Trump, but disrespecting the United States. So this was the general attitude of Moon Jae-in. So fortunately, South Korea has moved towards the center, and we look forward to a better relations with Seoul. And Yoon's first foreign trip is going to be to Washington, so that's a good sign. South Korea has very interesting politics. It had generally a pattern, a very closely divided electorate. You would have two left-leaning presidents, and then that was Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. Then you had two conservative-leaning candidates. Then you had Moon, the current president, who was the first of the left-leaning candidate. And everyone sort of assumed that there would be a second left-leaning candidate winning in the March election. But that didn't happen. So the pattern has been broken. Now, this election in South Korea was fought not on foreign policy, it was fought on domestic issues by and large, as most elections are, but this one was especially discontent with the current government. So it's very fortunate for us that we ended up, because of reasons that may have nothing to do with us, we ended up with someone who actually is willing to work with us.
That economic aspect is interesting because Grant Newsham wrote recently that the best response now would be to create economic ties to South Korea as quickly as possible, so that you can see benefit from electing somebody who has a good relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, we have a strong security partnership, but that partnership was being eroded. So we should cement that with economic ties. There's another question from Seymour again. What are Japan and Australia's roles in defending Taiwan or impeding Chinese expansionism? Japan has been very clear about its support for Taiwan. And I think the reason is, if you look at a map, maybe not this one, but basically Japan and Taiwan are part of the same island chain. And matter of fact, if you look at the southernmost, westernmost inhabited Japanese island, it's Yonaguni. Yonaguni is actually south of Taipei. And on a clear day, you can see Taiwan from Yonaguni. The reason why this is not just a tourist point, this is a question of geopolitics, is because for China to successfully invade Taiwan, it needs to establish an embargo. And it needs to have that line in the sea. And in order to, you were referring to this before in your initial remarks, in order to have that sea lanes control, it has to control Yonaguni. And that means that for China to successfully take over Taiwan, it's also got to take over Japanese islands. So Japan understands that. And so we have seen over, let's say, the last 18 months, increasingly frequent comments from Japanese political figures talking about the need to defend Taiwan, which is the reason why I mentioned in July of last year, China threatened to go after Tokyo. So that's increasingly important part of the defense of Taiwan. About Australia, Australia is interesting in the sense that last July or the middle of last year, they had this AUKUS pact. It's defense cooperation. It's both the United States, well, both Australia and the UK are already treaty partners of the US. But the interesting thing is that they have this new pact, which is for the production of nuclear submarines, nuclear powered submarines. And this really puts, as you were talking about, Australia has gone through a sea change. Australia, which is very dependent on selling iron ore and coal to China, now has become, and China actually thought that they owned Australia for a point, but now they don't. And that's a very good thing. Again, it's another country in the region reacting to Chinese overdoing it. So most people assume that Australia would come to Taiwan's defense as well.
If they could get off their coast.
If
They could get off their coast, which is what the Solomons thing is about.
Well, I think Australia is starting to understand that it is threatened by China in a way that it didn't before. And although, as you point out, their response to the Solomon Islands is inadequate, they still haven't changed the old style colonial mentality. Nonetheless, they do realize they are threatened. And so I think that perception is starting to work through so that people in Taiwan, in Australia understand that they have got a real stake in this. And, and we Americans do too. This is not just sort of America defending Taiwan for Taiwan's sake. This is America defending American interests. Because if you look back, you have to go back to the 1880s or the 1890s, where Americans started to draw their Western defense perimeter, not off Hawaii, but off of the coast of East Asia. And Taiwan is in the center of that critical defense line. This is where the South China Sea and the East China Sea meets. This is where it is important for us to prevent the Chinese Navy from surging into the Pacific. And also, it goes beyond just the geopolitical location of Taiwan, and it goes beyond the fact that Taiwan makes all the world's semiconductors. One company on Taiwan, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, makes 90% of the world's made-to-order semiconductors. So China certainly wants that. But it's more than just geopolitical location. It's more than just semiconductors. It's also the whole issue of democracy. Because you talk about the three warfares and political warfare, China has been attacking our democracy every day. But more important, China attacks this whole notion of democracy. And this is a full-on attack on our society and our way of life. And so Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. We can't allow the Chinese to take over any democracy, especially one as important as Taiwan. So defending Taiwan is, in a real sense, defending America. And we should understand the stakes there are, of course, for the people in Taiwan, but the stakes are also there for the United States. This is a test of our credibility. If we let the Chinese take Taiwan, we probably, it's obviously lights out for the US and Asia, but it's also lights out for the US and Europe and the Middle East and everywhere else, because this is the test of our ability to defend others and our friends.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. Going back to, I believe you said that Xi Jinping is casualty adverse, and it's always impressive to me the number of civilian losses dictators are willing to take. Stalin, Mao Zedong, and why would Xi Jinping's calculus be any different than Mao Zedong's, willing to let millions die for the cause of socialism?
That's a great question. And when you look at Xi Jinping's toll, Mao Zedong, just to sort of set the background, historians don't know how many people Mao Zedong is responsible for killing. If you like the guy, you say 30 million. If you don't like the guy, you say 70 million. But it's in the tens of millions of premature deaths that are directly responsible for actions of Mao Zedong. This is not just the bloodletting when the communists took over, but it's also the anti-rightist campaign, the Great Leap Forward, where most of those deaths occurred, and the Cultural Revolution. Well, Xi Jinping is now he hasn't reached the 10 million mark yet, but he's really responsible for millions of deaths. As Cleo was talking about, We don't know the 100% the origin of COVID-19, but we do know one thing, and that is that the deaths outside China are the direct result of decisions that the Chinese government made to deliberately spread this disease. The Chinese not only allowed, you talked about the shutting down air traffic in China, but allowing Chinese to travel elsewhere. Xi Jinping actually pressured other countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China while he was locking down his own country. And at the same time, for weeks, he lied about contagiousness of the disease. He knew that SARS-CoV-2 was highly contagious, highly transmissible human to human, but he told the world it was not. You put those two things together, and it means that the 6.1 million deaths outside China, each one of those is a murder. And that's including 990,000 Americans as of this morning. Each one of these deaths are a murder. So guy's got a lot of blood on his hands. The world doesn't view it that way, unfortunately. The Chinese don't view it. As you can imagine, there's not much discussion of the Wuhan Institute of Virology inside of China. So people are not connecting the COVID-19 deaths to China or the Chinese regime. But it's hard to understand why there should be your question about why there should be this distinction between civilian and military deaths, but there is. Because we know the way the regime has reacted to the deaths in Galwan. The other thing is, and I think that it has to do with the mood of the Chinese people right now. If you're talking about deaths of Chinese service people outside of China, you're talking about deliberate decisions to attack a neighbor. And I don't think the Chinese people are in that mood right now. Remember, their economy is stagnant. We Americans are used to the concept of a recession. In our relatively free market, prices go up, prices go down. That's not true in China. The Chinese people, since the end of the Cultural Revolution, have not really known a real recession. One can argue that there were downturns at the end of the 1990s and the rest of it, but the mentality in China is that everything goes up. Well, if your mentality is that economies only go up, but your economy right now is going down, you're in no mood to go out and kill people in Taiwan. It's just not. It's not on the list of things for you to do. Your list is your own livelihood. You're worried about being locked down. You're worried about real estate prices in the real estate market. Because remember, real estate in China is not like an asset. It is a store of value. It is currency. So all of these problems are hitting China, and the Chinese people are saying, I don't want I don't want a war. Maybe things will turn. Maybe the economy will get better. COVID goes away, and they'll say, yeah, let's go kill some Indians. But that's not now. So that's the reason why I think the party is so casualty averse right now. As I said, that may not be a great answer, but the point is, we know the way the regime is acting. They are casualty adverse. They're doing some really funny stuff. We haven't seen this in a very long time. So it means the mentality, the Communist Party leaders are looking at the mentality of the Chinese people, and they're judging that foreign misadventures are extremely unpopular.
Gordon, I'm over you. I want to add one more.
This is why you bring your wife to events.
No, your boss. I'm not just your wife.
The boss.
You talk about what the difference between now and Mao's time is. Now there's only one male in the bloodline because of the one-child policy. So a lot of families only have one son, whereas during Mao's time you have 3, 4, 5, or how many more sons. So the loss of that bloodline is really important. Even though you see China as a very modern society, that sense, the Confucian sense of carrying on the bloodline, it's still very strong in the Chinese society. So losing your only son, especially to a war in Taiwan, which Chinese people feel those are Chinese as well. Why am I losing my son to fight other Chinese? So that's why Taiwan is especially unpopular.
When Mao Zedong died in 1976, the total fertility rate in China, in other words, the average number of children per female of childbearing age, was 5.9. Today, Beijing says the TFR is 1.3, but a lot of demographers say that that's absurd. It's probably 0.9. Some people will say the highest it can be is 1.1. And I think that probably the demographers at the lower end of the range are probably right about this. So that means, a one-child policy, which means, as Lydia says, this is a bloodline which is extinguished, which could be extinguished in a war. So, wars are usually not popular with parents in any event, but this one would be especially unpopular given the way things are. In Mao's time, you have 6 kids. Actually, the TFR was even higher before he died. So you lose one. It's a tragedy, but it doesn't mean the end of the family name. Now, of course, it does. And that's why service in the PLA is not entirely popular these days in Chinese society.
And to add to the specific case of the Indian thing, it was a loss. Right? You don't want to publicize a lot. It was a loss of face for the PLA. They tried a maneuver. They initiated a maneuver that failed, got their people killed. And they're really racist. They lost to the Indians, right? So this is, a double loss for the PLA. They don't want this publicized. And that Indian front is it's a brutal front. I mean, it's just in terms of living conditions. It's very high altitude. It's cold. Logistical support is patchy, although it's improving a lot. People don't want to fight there. Like there are videos on the Indian internet, true or not, of Chinese soldiers crying when they're learning that they have to go up to the hill to fight in the Himalayas. So those are all elements as well. But this issue of, just to bring these two issues together, of how many people is Xi Jinping killed, and the One China policy. I mean, the One China policy was a brutal infanticide, decades long exercise where they, and this is why the Chinese Communist Party is so unpopular in many other parts of the world. The things that many people consider core parts of their identity, which is family, faith, whatever your faith happens to be, and freedom, are antithetical to the Chinese Communist Party. They're all direct threats to the Chinese Communist Party. So if you're dealing with a leadership that's willing to do the sort of kind of forced sterilizations and infanticide that we saw in China, imagine what they're willing to do to other people who aren't China, right? People feel that. And people know, I mean, we were talking, great, people in the Solomons know how the Chinese Communist Party throws Christians in jail and throws Muslims in concentration camps and sells the organs of Falun Gong. So that's faith and family, and in terms of freedom, you don't have to go much further than the name, the Chinese Communist Party. So when Solomon Islands switched from Taiwan to China in 2019, the premier of Malaita province, which is the most populous province in Solomons, put out this communique supported not just by this whole government, but all the traditional chiefs, saying, we don't want any Chinese Communist Party businesses to operate in our province. And one of the main reasons they gave was, we believe in freedom of religion. We are devout Christians, and the Chinese Communist Party is systemically atheist, the term that they use. So there is, we don't talk about those things in modern Western civilized societies, but in a lot of parts of the world, the faith, family, and freedom are not abstract concepts. They're what define your identity, and they can see the Chinese Communist Party coming a mile away and how that threatens people who don't have much. They live in villages. They're not going to university. They have their little plot of land, but their identity comes from their community and their family and their faith and their ability to vote once every 3 or 4 years. And Chinese Communist Party wants to take all that away from them. So again, that's how do you fight back? Those people will fight to their core to protect themselves and their communities, and figuring out how to help them is incredibly important.
Here's a question for you. It's from Anonymous. What are your thoughts on India's desires to strengthen partnership with the US? I guess this is about the, oh, sorry. No.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So actually, what I hear is the relationship with the U.S. is going very well in areas that they're not talking about publicly. So we saw the AI deal was signed recently. So in terms of defense and intelligence sharing, it seems to be going pretty well. But there's a strong Sino-Wahhabi lobby in the U.S. What can I tell you? That is going to go after India in any way it can to try to create those divides. That's why you see currency manipulation. Soon after the Biden administration came in, the currency manipulation thing coming up and religious freedoms thing, which has some truth to it. But what tends to happen is that they take China takes, and Russia, something that might have a kernel of truth, and then they blow it up and then lead you towards the wrong solution. The solution that benefits them, but not necessarily your domestic situation. So a lot of that is happening, trying to manipulate the relationship between the US and India. But just to go back to the Japan thing, in 2005, I observed a delegation from India that went to Taiwan. And the message from India was, we both have the same enemy. We're both dealing with China. But we need investment. We have 10 million Indians graduating from university every year. They need jobs. China's offering investment. We don't want their investment because we know what comes along with it. But if Taiwan invested in India, then we would be invested in the future of Taiwan. And we're the only country that could viably open up a second front on China. So if we care about Taiwan, then we can cause trouble for China on the border if they try to attack you by sea. That message didn't take off so much at that time in Taiwan, but I think it's taken off in Japan, which is why you're starting to see a lot more Japanese investment in India and in very sensitive locations like the Northeast. There was just a delegation, Kishida was just in India, and they announced pretty major investment in the Northeast, which is a highly sensitive location close to the Chinese border, or on the Chinese border. So that sort of, again, is this bringing the economic component into the strategic partnership building. We're starting to see outside the U.S. sphere. So the U.S. knows about it, and I must approve, I would hope, but it's not being necessarily created by the US, but we're starting to see that happen. And in the case of Australia, so Australia stood up to China in very brave ways around things like the origin of COVID-19 and took an economic hit. And that has to be appreciated and acknowledged. But they really messed up in the Pacific Islands. And I think that's because, like all countries, there's more than one Australia. So the people who are dealing with the Pacific Islands tended to mostly be from the academic community, from the development community. I would get told, don't say what you're saying about China, you're just going to provoke them. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of China, right? If China's going to advance until it's stopped, and then it'll find another way to advance. You're not going to provoke them by helping Malaita province have American companies work there instead of the Chinese companies. All you're going to do is give the people of Malaita more leverage to push back on China. So I think what's happened, and it's sort of entertaining to see, if you look at the Australian press, it used to all be university academics that were writing about the Pacific, Australian and New Zealand university academics. And they'd say, oh, you don't understand, it's so complicated, there are all these different ethnic groups, and I spent a month up in the mountains with the people of so-and-so, and I understand this better than anybody else. they've sort of all been swept to the side, and now it's all like the military and strategic analysts who are writing about this all. It's like, this isn't about your tribe up in the village. This is about Beijing and what it's deciding to do in this country and the small group of the elite in the capital that is captured. So we'll see if they come up with a different solution. But credit where credit is due for Australia and China, and hopefully they'll come up to par in the Pacific.
Did you have a follow-up? Okay. A question from online. Your comment that both parties in Washington are deliberately avoiding warning signs from China. Why is this? Yeah, that's a great question. Part of it is China has inserted itself into global supply chains. So Walmart will lobby for China. Goldman Sachs, of course, wants to do business in China's financial markets. So you have the US financial community fully in support of Beijing. Also, I think it's just sort of, just blindness. We really had this mentality in the US of trying, especially after the Cold War, of trying to integrate countries into the international system. Because we believe that, for instance, the end of history, where basically the world, no matter, we'll have politics, but everyone will be democratic and everyone will believe in free markets. This was a gross misunderstanding of the way history worked. I mean, we're Americans, we feel we're entitled to do this. But right now, I think we're starting to understand in many quarters, not in all quarters, but in many quarters that the world is extremely dangerous and we have enemies. And the one thing that the Ukraine invasion has done is I think it's changed people's perception about the way the world works. John Kerry in 2014, when Russia took over Crimea, talked about sort of lecturing Russia about this isn't the 19th century anymore. But the point is, especially now in 2022, this is the 19th century, or this could be the dark ages. And we Americans have got to understand the world is fundamentally changing. There are enemies out there that hate us. And it's not about American policy. It's about just the way these regimes operate. And until we come to that understanding, we're at risk of losing our country, because although we're far stronger than China, we have a political class that is not defending us. And that is extremely dangerous. One final point, and that is, the Chinese always say that we're hostile towards them. But the United States worked very hard to integrate China into the international system. And American presidents maintained policies that were more favorable to China than they were to the United States for a long time. And still there's this innate hostility that the Communist Party exhibits. And the reason is it's not about American policy towards China. It's just that you have a deeply insecure communist regime. It's worried about the inspirational impact that the United States has on the Chinese people. And because of that, as long as we're a democracy, as long as we believe in freedom and human rights, we will be considered an existential threat to China. And there's nothing we can do about it unless we decide to become a communist regime, in which case we can then maybe get along with China. But until that happens, this is an existential fight. And as much as this is an unpopular thing to say, I'll say it anyway, and that is, over the long term, Communist Party of China and the United States, only one's going to survive. Can't be both. And we have to understand that it's us who have to survive this for many reasons. But it is an existential fight.
So, full disclosure, I'm a Canadian. So I need you guys to survive because this often gets sort of, it's not. The U.S. is not just the U.S. The U.S. it's a system, it's a mindset, it's a way of being. U.S. is exceptional. The way that it came into creation and the ideas that founded it, although imperfect and working towards a more perfect union, have never happened before. They're extraordinary. and they give hope and guidance to a lot of other people that are all around the world. And so, you know, the idea that this is just a, you know, that China has to destroy all of that. It is, as Gordon says, a systemic fight. So the U.S. is the most visible component of that because you're the biggest, obviously. But around you, supporting you, behind you are a lot of the world, including in countries that are currently being co-opted by China. So it's not, it's this, people kind of say, you know, like-minded countries, blah, 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 blah. It means something. Like-minded people mean something, and they are potential allies that will fight to the death in the case of some of the people in the Solomons we've seen it. And this question of why is there this bipartisan lack of, if you actually understand the problem, it's terrifying, and it's difficult. And politicians, like, they're not great at difficult, complex problems that require, you know, big solutions. As one. The other is, as human beings, you have a tendency to think people think kind of like you, and that if you just sat down and talked to them, this is what happened in Alaska. You know, Jake Sullivan may very well have thought if he just sits down and talks to the Chinese, you know, they could work it out. But that Chinese leadership does not think like an American. You know, the kind of the closest I've managed to get is they're like a Bond villain with an engineering degree. You know, they've got that combination of lack of morality and belief that you could put everything down on a piece of paper and then that's reality, that comes out as insane, but has been working for them. And when it doesn't work for them, they cover it up. So understanding that the mentality of the leadership in the Chinese system is completely different, that they will kill huge numbers of their own population if it keeps them in power, that they will, like this thing about demographics coming down to half the size, coming down to the size of the population of the US, they probably think that's great. They probably think that will be more efficient for resource use. They can have a higher standard of living like the US. They have they say they've got this 100-year, 200-year time frame. So they create a meaner, leaner, smaller, tighter, more efficient, wealthier country. And if, you know, a few hundred million die along the way, whether it's through the one-child policy or through other things, then fine, as long as it doesn't come back to bite them politically like it would with the.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, thank you for hanging out for the Q&A session. It'll be about 35 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, Slido, and it's 110079 to add your questions, and we'll go through the next 35 minutes with questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought I'd start off with just asking the question, what do you think your country is? Because this is an important issue in Asia. In the break, someone said that they knew someone from Taiwan who felt that the Taiwanese would not defend themselves. And this particular person was ethnically Chinese. So a number of people in Taiwan view their country not as Taiwan, but as China. And if you think your country is China, then of course you're not going to defend Taiwan, because although you may not like the people in Beijing, you're thinking it's important for national unification. The same thing, and the reason why I'm talking about this is because you have the same issue in South Korea. So in South Korea, the population, if you look at attitudes towards the US, is roughly divided into three segments. It's the eldest portion are very pro-American because they were alive during the Korean War and they realized the sacrifices that Americans made for Korea. If you look at the people who are in their 60s, it's virulently anti-American because they perceived that America, wrongly, but they perceived that America stood in the way of the democratization of South Korea. And they view their country as Korea, not South Korea, but Korea. And so therefore they are very, very, many of them believe that the idea is that you should support the North Koreans because they're other Koreans. It's not like they're communists or that they're evil. They're just other Koreans, and your country is Korea. If you look at the youngest South Koreans in the bottom cohort, interesting. If you were to go back, let's say, at the beginning of this century, they were mostly anti-American. But today, they are reluctantly pro-American. And the reason is that this cohort views its country as not Korea, but as South Korea. And they realize that the only thing that prevents the Koreans north of the demilitarized zone from destroying them is the United States military. So they view themselves as basically more conservative in the sense that, at least on geopolitical issues, they're very sort of, yeah, we got to keep the Americans around. We may not like them, but boy, we really need them. So if you believe that your country is South Korea, then you are going to be pro-American because of what I mentioned. But if you believe your country is Korea, then yeah, it's get the Americans out. They're just interfering in the natural sort of move of the Koreans to reconstitute their nation.
Can I ask you a question about Samsung?
Yeah.
Because this is part of the China's comprehensive national power thing. So we know that Huawei has been basically burned internationally. Whether you take Huawei or not, you know what it is, a surveillance arm of the Chinese state. But what seems to have happened, at least under the previous administration in Korea, was there was increasing infiltration of Samsung. And if I was China, if I was a Bond villain with an engineering degree, I'd like to get a clean skin for my tech. And Samsung is considered clean.
Yeah, Moon Jae-in, the current president, whose term ends next month, actually tried to help China take Samsung's technology by forcing it out into the open, which the beneficiaries were China. So if Lee Jae-myung was elected, which he wasn't, but if he were elected, we could have sort of assumed that Samsung would become part of, this big Chinese tech conglomerate, definitely controlled by China. Fortunately, that's not going to happen, and I hope that Yoon Suk-yeol, who will be president on May 10th, actually stops this drift of forcing Samsung to deal with China.
And are the unions, the Samsung unions, potentially infiltrated?
Well, they're Korean labor, which means that they are, they're leftists. The thing about South Korea is that it has got an almost evenly divided electorate, just like the United States. And it swings back and forth between the two sides. In Korea, there are no fixed political parties, it seems. They come and go. So you have generally they call themselves progressives, but we would call them leftists. And then you have conservatives or conservative leaning. And those political parties, they change names and they reform them themselves. So it's very interesting. In our country, it's evenly divided, but we have two parties that have been around since the 1800s. So at least for the moment, the political system it's changing, but it's got two political parties. It's a very different situation in South Korea. Talk about, do people think like us? Maybe not. Maybe not. There are a lot of questions we didn't get to.
Yeah, I would just to follow up on what you're talking about. The Hong Kong thing is kind of interesting because that for people in Taiwan was very important.
Here's a time to take a. There's a lot of ways we think the Chinese think, but a lot of them are not true. So there's a cliche that Chinese are long-term thinkers. That is definitely not true, or at least the communists are not long thinkers. And I'll get to Hong Kong, but let me give some context to it. During 2 millennia of Chinese rule, you had the cabinet ministers every morning would greet the emperor with chanting 3 times, long live you for 10,000 years. And so Chinese emperors were pretty much long-term thinkers. They thought not only about what happened during their rule, they thought about what happened during their sons and the rest of it. So it was long-term thinking. But Chinese communists, I don't think are long-term thinkers. And here's an example which shows you that they are extremely short-term thinkers. Britain in 1984 agreed to return Hong Kong to quote unquote China. And there was a Sino-British joint declaration, and the deal was that in 1997, Hong Kong would be quote unquote handed over, and China promised 50 years of a high degree of autonomy under the one country, two systems formula. So at 2047, Beijing was getting Hong Kong back with no restrictions on the way it could rule. This one country, two systems formula was developed by Deng Xiaoping, who was Mao Zedong's successor, not for Hong Kong, where it was in fact applied, but for Taiwan. So people in Taiwan, of course, were looking at Hong Kong to see what would China do to them, because Hong Kong was the perfect political science example. Well, Chinese communists are meddlers. They have to control things. They couldn't help themselves. And they've basically taken over Hong Kong. And this has pushed people in Taiwan away from China. So we go back to 2019. You got the demonstrations, you got Beijing overreacting. This was an important year because Tsai Ing-wen, who is the current president of Taiwan, is now in her second term. She's the Democratic Progressive Party. She was not going to get her second term. She wasn't even going to get the nomination of her party for a second term. But because of what China did to Hong Kong in 2019, people in Taiwan said, holy crap, I don't want this. And so Tsai Ing-wen got the nomination of the Democratic Progressive Party, and she went on to win in a landslide, which was something really incredible because she was so unpopular. But Beijing, because it couldn't help itself on Hong Kong, has now forced Taiwan away from China. And Taiwan is a much bigger prize because it's beyond China's grasp. So this shows you that Chinese communist leaders are short-term thinkers. And we can take advantage of that if we can get our act together, because there are a lot of things that you can do to make life very difficult for short-term thinkers. So that's Hong Kong. Another question.
So what I'd add to that is that what it also shows is that they have blind spots. They have a hard time understanding how people who value faith, family, and freedom, in this case freedom, will react. And so the instinct is to try to suppress it. And I think that's possibly part of what happened. But also the Hong Kong thing, and I wonder what you think about this, is a lot of Chinese foreign policy seems to kind of be based on the, oh yeah, so what are you going to do about it approach. And in the case of Scarborough Shoal, which was also almost exactly 10 years ago now, when they took over Philippines fishing ground, and Kurt Campbell, who is today on his way to the Solomon Islands, was part of the negotiating team that said, okay, the Philippines pulls back and China pulls back, and then we'll sort it out. And then the Philippines pulled back and China didn't pull back, and then started to militarize the islands. And what did the US do about it? Well, nothing. And so based on how many times they got away with people doing nothing about it, I'm just going, and that's kind of, you go right up to the line and then push from there. They may have thought they could get away with it.
Yeah, they probably did. Scarborough Shoal is very interesting because Kurt Campbell brokered a deal between Beijing and Manila for Scarborough Shoal is a reef. It's only got like one rock, which is visible at high tide. But it's really important because it's 124 nautical miles from the main Philippine island of Luzon. It guards the mouths to Manila and Subic Bay. So it's a really strategic rock. And as Cleo was saying, in early 2012, you have both the Chinese and Philippine fishing fleets crowding around Scarborough Shoal. And Kurt Campbell, in the Obama administration at the time, then brokers this agreement for both sides to withdraw their craft. but only the Philippines complies, it leaves China in control. And the Obama administration decides to do nothing about enforcing the agreement that they themselves put together. And the feeling was, we don't want a confrontation with China. But this is sort of goes back to your point of about we don't understand the way the Chinese think. The Chinese looked at this and said, oh, Obama doesn't want a confrontation. Let's go out and accomplish what we want to do. So what do? Within months of taking over Scarborough, they start pressuring Second Thomas Shoal, which is another Philippine feature of the South China Sea. They start to reclaim the 7 islands in the Spratly chain, which the famous reclaimed islands. And they then start ramping up the pressure on Japan on the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. So China just goes out and makes the problem bigger. And so now we are faced with, what we did was we said to the Chinese political establishment, the Obama administration emboldened the worst elements in Beijing by showing everybody else that aggression works. So we Americans, history is going to look back on us and say, oh, no, you're not the villains in this, but you were so much stronger than China. You permitted this villainy to occur. You created the conditions under which aggressors could act. And so it's no surprise that we've got a really aggressive, belligerent, provocative Chinese military establishment, which now looks to be extremely influential in Beijing, because we basically said to everybody else, yeah, go run over us. I mean, the people in our State Department, I tend to believe that they never went to school. They never saw a schoolyard bully. And they never understood the concept of dating, which is if you're less interested in the other party, you have more power in the relationship. This is dating 101. And we do not take that lesson into our relations with Beijing. Fundamental failure of American diplomacy.
Speaking of which, the boss.
Speaking of which, the boss. You can see who has the power in this relationship. She says, oh.
Okay. She's my boss too. Oh, okay, I've got to go back to the questions. Okay, so here we go. But actually, we've got some good questions here that tie into the same region, which is Singapore, which often gets left out of this conversation, right? So the 2 questions, they're linked. What's the strategic relationship between Singapore and China, and the strategic significance of Singapore in China's strategy?
Wow. Well, Singapore's political establishment is ethnically Chinese. They claim to have a peaceful multiracial society with Malays and Indians, but the Chinese dominate. So they find a lot of affinity with Beijing. And that's why you have the Singapore Prime Minister will often lecture the United States in public, as he did a week ago, about all sorts of things. Singapore doesn't want to become a dictatorship. I don't think it wants to see Beijing take over the region. And so it does have, for instance, a basing agreement with the US Navy. It is, got vibrant economic relations with us. But on diplomatic matters, it often is, I wouldn't say it's in China's camp, but it often sides with China. It's like India in a sense. And we can fix this problem because the people in Singapore, just generally they want to have the trappings of democracy. They certainly want to have the trappings of a free market. They want to be part of the world. And so this is something that if we were better, I think we'd have more sway than we do with Singapore. But clearly, Singapore foreign policy sort of wavers back and forth.
It's an important location.
Absolutely important location. Straits of Malacca. This is a lot of China's foreign policy is meant to avoid the problems of the Strait of Malacca and Singapore's location. Because what they want to do is they want this land bridge that goes down and avoids the Strait of Malacca going directly into the Arabian Sea or Indian Ocean. And that land bridge is 2 parts. One of it is Pakistan, China and Pakistan, Karakoram Highway, as you talked about, which we still don't have a picture of. And the other one is a land bridge, Afghanistan into Iran. Part of Beijing's desire to support the Afghan Taliban is because they want to have that route directly into the Arabian Sea. And China actually, during the Afghan insurgency, was supplying not only small arms, but also pretty big arms to the Taliban, which were used, by the way, to kill Americans and NATO soldiers. And by the way, we didn't do anything about it. This is our fault. We allowed China to supply weapons to a party that was killing Americans. This is just wrong.
And the Iran thing also brings in the India thing. So India has resisted American pressure to dial back its relationship with Iran, which isn't fulsome, but it exists for two reasons. One is there's a very large Shia population in India that is not radicalized, and they're scared of them becoming radicalized. The other is Chabahar Port, which India is developing with Iran, like as an alternative for the Central Asian states to using water. So they're trying to work with Iran to unblock Central Asia and give a competition to China in the region. This is a level of geopolitical complexity that a country like the U.S. that has two land borders isn't used to dealing with.
Yeah, we're blessed. I mean, we really are blessed. I mean, we've got two neighbors that don't want to fight us.
Well, yeah, I mean, once we beat you in 1812, we were like, job done, and then we went back home. Yeah, so let's just go on to some of these other ones because we've left Russia by the side. By the way, I don't know if anybody follows Canadian news, but our defense minister publicly said we sent all of our weapons to Ukraine and we have no more weapons. So if you want revenge for the War of 1812, now's your time. China doubles Russian coking coal imports as rest of world shuns Moscow. Impacts of China's steel processing. What are your thoughts?
You know, the really interesting thing here is not so much that China is buying a lot more of Russian commodities, but it's doing so at a time when China has less need for coking coal. Because if you noticed a couple of days ago, Beijing, for a number of reasons, decided it needs to reduce steel production. So if you're reducing steel production, you're not buying more coking coal. If you're buying more coking coal from the Russians, it means you really, really want to support Russia. So this is like one of those tells that shows you how much China really wants to support Russia.
So I'll read this next question, and I'm going to add on a little bit of my own question to it too, which is, what are your thoughts regarding impacts on China's perspective with Russia, with the ongoing Ukrainian war revealing more of Russia's strengths and weaknesses? That's the question. And I'm going to just add an economic component to it because, are we seeing the sort of turbocharging an alternative economic structure developing with different outside of the US dollar system and potentially shifting to the digital currency, which is what, of course, China wants. Is that actually happening or not?
I worry a lot about Chinese threats. I don't worry about the currency. And the reason is, China, of course, wants its currency to be the world's reserve currency. But it ain't happening, folks. And it can't happen for three reasons. One of them is, if you want, China's renminbi is convertible on the capital, on the current account. Sometimes. It really isn't many times. But it's not convertible on the capital account. You can't have a global reserve currency that is not fully convertible. Second of all, structurally, you can't have a global reserve currency if you refuse to run deficits, because you have to run deficits to get your currency out into the world, because it's a world's reserve currency. People are using it. Well, if they don't have it, it can't become a world's reserve currency. And China consistently runs current and capital account surpluses. So that's another reason. And the third reason is, to have a world's reserve currency, the world has got to trust your central bank to manage the currency to the benefit of everybody. And as bad as the Fed is, it's a lot better than the People's Bank of China. So, China talks about this all the time. It just hasn't happened. China in 1994, I believe, started to first make its promises of a fully convertible renminbi, and they promised to do it by the turn of the century. Since the turn of the century, which they missed that deadline, they've promised 2 more times, and of course they've missed 2 more times. So it's just the usage of the renminbi last time I looked 6 months ago was like under 5% for international transactions. I'm sure it's up a little bit now because of a couple of reasons, but it's still pretty minuscule. And I think that as China goes through its financial crisis, which that becomes more obvious, then I believe that currency is going to be less useful. The digital renminbi is renminbi, but remember, the digital currency gives the People's Bank of China the complete ability to know transactions in real time involving the digital currency. Also, it gives the People's Bank of China the ability, because it's a digital currency, to completely confiscate it or to force people to use it by giving them incentives to say, well, if you don't use it by such and such date, it'll disappear. So there are all sorts of reasons why the digital renminbi won't take over, because it's a digital currency run by a government known to, override economics with geopolitical concerns. So just people aren't going to want to use it. It's just, so I don't see it. The reason why I think the renminbi is probably going to gain a little bit of usage is because of some really bad policy we have with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia will start to pay to accept a little bit of its oil in renminbi, but it's not going to be much. And the U.S. Abraham Accords during the Trump administration really were historic. And if we go back to them, I think that we'll solve our problems with the Saudi kingdom.
We have this digital currency thing is something as a Canadian, I don't know how many of you, did you follow the truckers protests in Canada? Did you follow how the government went after people who supported the protesters? Yeah, so we had, it was brought up in Parliament, single mom who donated $50. First of all, just to be clear, this has now been made clear in court, they were not illegal, right? They were there was an injunction against honking at one point. And so during certain hours, they stopped honking. But the fact that the injunction was just against the honking just tells you that the rest of the thing was legal. Like it was not an illegal demonstration. It has not been proven to be an illegal demonstration. So there's one case that's sort of the classic case of a woman who gave $50 for food for the truckers on their way to Ottawa and who had her bank accounts frozen. And this is now on her permanent financial record. And our Attorney General made a statement. They asked whether American people should be concerned about having donated. And the vast majority of the money is also now very clear, came from Canadians and not from foreigners. But he actually said, well, if you're a Trump supporter and you give a lot of money, then you should be worried. So I was talking to American investors not long after that, and they're like, you should have no interest in my political affiliations. And if you get to decide what happens to my money based on my political affiliations, then I'm not going to invest in your country. Right? And it spooked the system, but the system has not, in Canada, has not readjusted. So the idea of using money that is not cash as leverage over your population has reached your border and needs to be very closely paid attention to. This is not kind of science fiction at the moment.
Yeah, the digital renminbi is not a cryptocurrency.
No.
It's just, you got to be very clear. I mean, it's subject to strict political control.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, they're trying to crack down, I think, on Bitcoin. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll ask there are three questions that are good kind of solutions questions at for the end. But there's a really interesting one, another one about Taiwan, which is, could an unsuccessful defense of Taiwan militarily still be a political success in terms of deterrence? And if so, what would that type of success look like?
That's really a fascinating question. And I think the answer is probably no. This is if China takes over Taiwan, it has just repercussions that just follow through. This is sort of the flip side of this is, Ukraine. What happens in an unsuccessful defense of Ukraine? Because the Russians seem to be doing fairly well in the Donbass. They're busy putting together their land bridge to Crimea. This could very well be snatching, basically turning a defeat into victory. I mean, there's a different sort of issue here, but in Taiwan, it's all or nothing, because it's not like you can break apart the country and divide it into parts. It's all one. Though the one thing I should say is that most of Taiwan, the topography is mountains. China can control maybe the coast, the western coast, but it could end up that it never controls the mountainsides. Really easy to defend, very hard to attack.
So, and there's just another Taiwan question related, which is, how does the U.S. exit from Afghanistan affect China's calculus on Taiwan? Or Afghanistan, I guess.
Yeah,
Ukraine
I mean,
also.
It was incompetent. It exhibited all sorts of failure. It was chaotic, and I think that a lot of people in Beijing looked at that and said, "The U.S. is done." Now, that's a misreading of American history. I mean, many times we have been done and have come back. But, you look at that. I mean, how can you defend what the Biden administration did? Leaving $85 billion worth of military equipment for the Taliban, leaving American citizens there. This is shameful. This is not just wrong strategically. This is just shameful. And it shows, the Chinese say they own the Biden administration. And the fastest, easiest way to get a laugh in China is to say, we control Americans, Hunter Biden. Now, I don't believe it, but I mean, that is true. But I don't believe that Joe Biden is that compromised. But this is what the Chinese believe. And if the Chinese believe that, they're going to act upon it. And that means the world's going to get very dangerous, because Joe Biden is going to have to start to defend us. And this is going to be a real problem going forward, because the Chinese will think they can do what they want. And as you say, they're not going to stop until they are stopped. So this perception is really, really dangerous in China. The Chinese mentality is dangerous, which is the reason why I talked about Di Dongsheng, because that shows you the way these guys are thinking, and that thinking has been reinforced by Afghanistan. Here I got a question.
Also, there's a U.S.-Russia Cold War question that doesn't seem to have a question. So if some person who wrote it is in the room and wants to ask
There's an implicit question. We can answer that.
Yeah.
My understanding is that China holds a lot of our debt. And there was a joke back in the Clinton administration. Why did Clinton go to China? Because the Chinese told him to. And so I wondered if we get into a real conflict with China and we default on that debt, is that a significant part of this play?
Yeah, I don't think that we'll default on the debt, but I don't think that debt has much effect on us, or shouldn't have. Hillary Clinton famously said, "We can't argue with our banker." I think that we can, and the reason is, if you go back to about 2008 or so, Chinese officials and Chinese generals have talked about the nuclear option, which is not launching missiles or anything. It's selling U.S. treasuries to hurt us. And every once in a while, you'll have some Chinese general officer say this in public, but they never do it. And the reason they don't do it is because the Chinese know something we don't know. And that is, the Chinese know it won't work. So think about this. 100% of America's debt is denominated in our own currency, which means that if the Chinese want to sell our debt to hurt us, they're going to get back dollars. If they want to hurt us, they got to take those dollars and they got to put them into some other currency, which means they got to buy euros, pounds, yen, whatever. Okay. The way the markets work, of course, is that those currencies are going to soar in value, which means that the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank are going to have to go out in the markets to rebalance their currencies. And the only way they can do that is to buy dollars. So this this Chinese nuclear option doesn't work. So this is not to say, and I don't believe that we should be spending money the way we're spending it. But the point is, if we want to do this, we can do it without China's permission because of the way the markets work. And by the way, China holds, we don't know exactly how much China holds because a lot of it's through nominees and a lot of it is for other reasons. China doesn't have as much in the way of reserves as they say they do. But we don't know exactly how much they hold, but let's say they hold 2 trillion, which is a number you hear. 2 trillion is just not a big number when you consider all of the liquid assets in the global financial system. So I worry about China, but I don't worry about them dumping our dollars because it ain't going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's huge vulnerabilities for China. I think the vulnerabilities on their side, and I would be very happy to start saying, well, you know what, COVID cost us a couple trillion, so maybe we'll take that off of, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like they're so.
Well, yeah, Trump wants 20 trillion in reparations.
Yeah, but this is the lawfare component of it. They'll use these systems to tie us up, but there's no going back to them and saying, look, this is the damage you. For example, there is one of the, and this is why there's a bit more legitimacy when it comes out of a place like India. One of the Indian analysts was saying, everybody's taken out a BRI loan should just say, you know what, COVID has destroyed our economies. We'll pay you back, but we'll pay you back in 10 years, and we're not going to pay interest in the meantime.
Yeah. And which is what they're saying, basically.
Yeah. And if all the countries did that, suddenly it's China's for, it's that old thing, if you own the bank 100,000, it's your problem. If you own them 100 million, it's their problem.
China's overextended, which is a conversation we don't have time for.
Yeah.
We are running out of time.
But I'm going to do the last.
There's this one question up here that we should answer as sort of like a wrap up.
Yeah, there's three solutions questions all in a row.
What are the key ideas you support that we as non-politicians can do to repress China's assertive threat to the U.S.? What is most important for the next generation of Americans to understand about the world stage international relations? And do you have suggested resources we should follow to keep up with information on China?
So,
yeah, your Twitter feed, maybe. Anyway, why don't you answer?
So the way I do China, the way I keep up with resources on China, it's kind of hard. Who's lived outside of the U.S.? Okay, so if you've lived outside of the U.S., then you know enough about the media and the places that you've lived to start looking at China from those medias and to take out that filter. Okay? So I look a lot at the Indian media for coverage about China. First of all, they're not scared of getting sued, and they've identified China as an enemy. China's killed their people, and they know how to fight it. We saw it with the banning of the Chinese apps, and there isn't the whole kind of racism component to it that can distort it. So there's a from a strategic perspective that the strategic analysts in the Indian media I found very useful. Similarly, strategic analysts in places like Japan or Taiwan or Korea, or, the ones that are closest to China know it best and are the most concerned. So, and don't have these other elements that political warfare has injected into our discussion around China that can make it kind of confusing. So that's how I do it. If you want specific, how do you do it? Oh, and talk to people on this.
Don't buy Chinese goods. Tell, don't invest into Chinese stocks. I like the idea of asking your representative and your senator to support country of origin labeling, because that way, you can make an informed decision of where you buy stuff. We got an election coming up. So go talk to the people who are running, who want your vote about what they think about China.
And the country of origin thing is really important because we have country where if you walk into Walmart, it'll say made in China. If you buy it off Amazon, they won't tell you where it's made. And if you go into the comments, you'll see a lot of comments. Is this made in China? Is this made? People want to vote with their pocketbook. They want to shift their money somewhere else. But the legislation around this, around making online retailers show country of origin, has been blocked in Congress. So, once you figure out how you want to fight it, that's one very good way of fighting it, is choke off the money flows. In terms of this,
the term of art is cool, COOL, country of origin labeling.
Yeah. And it not only would it hit China, but showing the money flowing to other sources empowers those other sources, American manufacturing or Thai or wherever it happens to go. And it shows the system, the retail system and the wholesale system, that there are other ways of doing it. So you put that roadblock in place and you force the deviation. I just say sorry, go ahead.
No.
Yeah. So and about these, what can you as non-politicians do, and what's the most important thing for the next generation to do? Like two things. So Afghanistan. What we focus on with Afghanistan is how it ended. But for 20 years, most of the girls in Afghanistan could go to school, that businesses flourish, people were it was definitely not perfect. But what it was before the Americans, NATO was there, and after is horrific. So for 20 years, you bought breathing space for a country and for the people of that country. And that has to be acknowledged and honored. Certainly was. The people of Afghanistan didn't want you to leave, right? They didn't want this to happen. They didn't want you to leave. That shows what just being there can accomplish in the most difficult environment. Imagine what happens if the US leaves Asia. Imagine what happens if you're not in South Korea, if you're not in Japan. How quickly does all of that fall apart? So that comes back to understanding what America is. So you want to tell what the next generation should do? How many of you actually have served in the military? So when you join the military, you swear an oath, right? What do you swear an oath to? The Constitution. How many of the people now joining the military have read the Constitution? Civics courses have been taken out of schools. People don't know what the US is. They don't know. As a Canadian, I see it from the outside, so I can understand it and acknowledge it. But if you want to know what to do about foreign policy, understand what your own country is. It's not a political thing. This is about talking to your friends and neighbors and whoever you shop with about things that are foundational, literally, to this country. Know who you are, and then you'll know what you're willing to fight for, and you'll know who your real friends are, and you'll know how to fight. So for me, those two questions come back to the same thing, which is know thyself, and the rest will become a lot clearer.
America is worth defending, and it's worth defending not because we're a great country, but because we're a good country.
Amen.
Thank you so much for that. I was asked that to get your Twitter feeds because you guys both have Twitter, I hear, and that you're very active on there. So I'll get that and we'll put it in an email to everyone. And I've also learned that there's going to be a list of publications, newspapers, books, and things that they both recommend that everyone look into if you want to learn more about the subject. So we'll get that wrapped up and tied in a bow, as our director would say, Chad, and I'll get that emailed out sometime in the next week. So with that, thank everyone for coming. I just want to put a plug in for our next Global Futures speaker series. We're going to do ethics in AI. It's going to be coming soon. So watch out for the RW newsletter or your emails, because you'll get information on that soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you to Gordon Chang and Ms. Cleo for being here. Thank you.
Keep the Doolittle spirit alive.